Hello, horror lovers. Welcome to our channel. Please subscribe as it is our biggest motivation. Let us know in the comments which city you're listening from. If you like this video, don't forget to hit the like button. Now, let's get into the stories. The apartment was stale, filled with the scent of something between dust and musty linens. Not terrible, but not pleasant either. As soon as I stepped inside, I was hit by the quiet. The kind of quiet that presses on your ears. It was unsettling, to say the least. The place was small but cluttered with remnants of a life that had been abandoned abruptly. Clothes were strewn across the floor, magazines and newspapers piled in corners, and dishes were still in the sink. I took a deep breath, letting the gravity of the situation settle in. This was someone's entire life, frozen in time, and it was my job to unravel it. I began by clearing the trash. Fast food wrappers, empty soda cans, and old mail made up the bulk of it. Every now and then, I'd come across something more personal, a photograph, a love letter, or a handwritten grocery list. I couldn't help but feel like I was intruding, peeling back layers of someone's existence. Yet I knew this was why the girl had hired me to give her the space to grieve without the burden of these memories. As I moved to the bedroom, I found a small box under the bed. It was old, wooden, and locked. My curiosity got the best of me, and I searched for something to open it with. After some time, I found a small key in the top drawer of the nightstand. It fit perfectly into the lock, and with a soft click, the lid opened. Inside was a collection of letters, old and worn, some stained with what looked like tears. There were photos, two of the girl and her mother, smiling and carefree, of her as a baby, and of a man I assume was her father. But beneath all that was something I hadn't expected. A diary. It was small, with a leather cover, and the pages were filled with neat, looping handwriting. I shouldn't have read it, I knew that. But something compelled me to turn the first page. March 14th. I don't know what to do anymore. I feel like I'm losing myself. I see her in the mirror sometimes. Not me, but her, my mother. She used to stand in front of this very same mirror, brushing her hair just like I do now. But when I look, it's her eyes staring back at me, not mine. Am I going crazy? I think I might be. I hear her too at night. Just a whisper, but it's enough to keep me awake. Enough to make me wonder if she's really gone. I paused, my heart beating a little faster. I shouldn't have been reading this. It wasn't mine to know, but I couldn't stop. I flipped to another entry. April 2nd. The dreams are getting worse. I see her standing at the foot of my bed, just staring. She doesn't say anything, but I know she wants something. What did I do wrong? Why is she haunting me? I haven't slept in days. I feel like I'm falling apart. Maybe I deserve this. Maybe I'm the reason she's stuck. Maybe I'm the reason she's still here. I quickly closed the diary and put it back in the box, my hands trembling slightly. The girl had never mentioned anything about her mother being like this, but then again, why would she? I felt a deep pang of guilt for having invaded such a private part of her life, but now I couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to this job than just clearing out an apartment. It took a few hours, but eventually the apartment was starting to look, well, habitable again. The cat, now fed and slightly more relaxed, was following me closely, his curiosity piqued by every rustling bag and creaking cabinet. I found myself talking to him like he understood, maybe because I needed the distraction. "You're lucky I found you, buddy," I muttered while wiping down the kitchen counters. "I don't know how long you'd have lasted on your own. he meowed, either in agreement or because he wanted more food. Either way, it was comforting to have the company. When the kitchen and living room were mostly cleared of trash, I took a moment to breathe. My back ached, and the smell of the apartment still lingered in my nose despite the mask. The cat had wandered back to the couch, curling up as if he'd claimed the spot. I'd have to come back another day to go through the sentimental items, the photographs, letters, and personal belongings that were scattered around, but for now, I had done enough. The apartment was starting to reveal a story, one that felt eerily familiar. I knew the girl, Amy, had a strained relationship with her mother. The way she had spoken about her cold, detached, it was like she was talking about a stranger, not the woman who raised her. The desperate way she wanted nothing to do with the cat, as if it was some lingering remnant of a painful memory, unsettled me. What had happened in this apartment? What secrets did it hold that Amy wanted buried along with her mother's things? As I packed up for the day, I couldn't help but glance at the diary I had found earlier. It was still sitting in the small box beneath the bed, as if waiting for me to open it again. I didn't, though, not yet. I had a feeling that once I started reading, I'd be dragged into something deeper than I'd expected. Before leaving, I scooped up the cat, who protested with a soft hiss before settling in my arms. "Don't worry, little guy, you're coming with me," I said softly. He didn't seem to mind too much. Maybe he knew that things were about to get better. Or maybe he just knew he wouldn't be alone anymore. As I walked out of the apartment, locking the door behind me, I couldn't shake the feeling that this was just the beginning. There were still too many unanswered questions. The cat curled up in the passenger seat of my car, and as I drove away, I couldn't help but wonder what other secrets that apartment was hiding and whether I was ready to uncover them. I sat there for a moment, digesting the last note. The creature she mentioned, was it the cat? Lucky, now snuggled up in my apartment, blissfully unaware of the bizarre reverence with which this woman had regarded him. I shivered, not just from the strangeness of it all, but because the tone of these notes had taken a much darker turn. This woman had clearly descended into some deep religious delusion. The codes, the symbols, the ciphers, all of it pointed to someone who was unraveling. And yet, there was a level of certainty in her words that made my skin crawl. She believed with every fiber of her being that she was serving a higher purpose. The idea that someone could live in this level of isolation, cut off from reality, while still functioning enough to maintain a facade of normalcy, well, it unsettled me. The radio crackled again, just as I reached for another note. This time I jumped, half expecting it to start spitting out another cryptic message, but it remained silent. I glared at it, unnerved. That thing was going off way too often for coincidence. A low hum filled the room, barely noticeable, but just enough to raise the hairs on the back of my neck. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. Maybe it was the tension of reading these unhinged ramblings. Maybe it was the faint smudges on the windows. Whatever it was, I felt it. The room felt colder, as if some invisible presence had entered and was now watching over my shoulder. I glanced over at the pile of notes, feeling hesitant to continue, but also knowing I had to push through. There was something in this room, something hidden in these papers that I needed to uncover. I picked up the next note. The false prophets walk among us. It began abruptly, without the usual preamble of her devotion to God. This one felt different, almost as if she had been interrupted mid-thought. "I saw one today, walking by the house. I know they come to tempt me, to lure me away from the Lord's path. But I will not falter. They will burn with the rest of the unworthy when the time comes. I have His word, His protection. I must prepare for the final days, when the earth will be cleansed and only the righteous will rise from the ashes. My heart raced as I read those words. This wasn't just about some religious obsession anymore. She truly believed the end was coming, and soon. The false prophets she mentioned, were they just passers-by, neighbors, or perhaps the kids I'd thought were messing with her? Another thought crossed my mind, one I didn't want to entertain but couldn't shake. What if those agents of the devil were anyone who had tried to help her? Doctors, family members, maybe even Amy herself. It would explain why Amy had distanced herself so much. The coldness in her voice, her reluctance to even acknowledge her mother's life, it all made sense now. She must have witnessed the deterioration firsthand, powerless to stop it. I continued to sift through the remaining notes, each more frantic than the last. There were detailed instructions about preparing for the apocalypse, stockpiling food, reinforcing the house, and keeping out the unworthy. The handwriting became sloppier, less controlled, and the sentences fragmented, jumping from topic to topic with increasing paranoia. Then, as I reached the bottom of the pile, I found one last note. This one was different, crumpled, as if hastily written and discarded in a moment of clarity. I fear I have been wrong. I paused, my fingers trembling as I unfolded it fully. I have followed his word. But I hear something else now. It whispers when I try to pray. It tells me things I do not want to hear. Horrible things. It ... It tells me that I am not worthy, that I have been abandoned. I know this is a test, but I am. I am so afraid. Lord, please, do not leave me. I will serve you faithfully until the end, but please, do not leave me in the dark. There was no signature, no date, nothing to indicate when she had written it, but the desperation in her words was palpable. The house felt different now, heavier, as if the weight of her delusions had imprinted themselves on the very walls. I needed to finish this job, but part of me wanted to leave and never return. The rational part of me knew that there were no ghosts here, no lingering spirits. But the emotional part, the part that had spent hours wading through this woman's deepest fears and madness, wasn't so sure. I gathered my things, casting one last glance at the radio. It was silent now, still. The air felt thick with the remnants of something unspoken, something unfinished. Lucky was curled up in the corner, and I got home, oblivious to everything. As I scratched his head and sat down beside him, I couldn't help but wonder what it must have been like for him, stuck in that apartment, alone with the madness of his owner, waiting for food that may never come. And yet he had survived. I thought about the woman, her notes, and the apocalyptic visions she had spent her last days fixating on. Was there something she knew that I didn't? Or was it all just the tragic descent of a mind lost to illness? I still don't have an answer. All I know is that some places, some people leave marks on the world long after they're gone. And sometimes those marks are too deep to ever be fully erased. But for now, Lucky and I had each other. And maybe that was enough to keep the dark at bay. As I finished recounting the events surrounding Teresa's house and her obsessive delusions, I couldn't help but feel the weight of her story lingering. It had taken me a while to get it all down, probably because I hadn't revisited those memories in such depth for a long time. It's funny, well, not funny in the literal sense, but even though I've cleared countless homes since, Teresa's house still sticks with me. That radio, for one thing, has become almost a symbol of my work. I'll admit I probably should have tossed it the day it nearly blew out my eardrums, but something told me to keep it, to honor Teresa's memory. A lot of people, if they had been in my shoes, would have thrown everything in the dumpster, or at least handed it off to Amy and washed their hands of it. But that's not what I do. I'm not sure what I expected when I kept the radio. Part of me thought it might help me make sense of everything: her notes, her delusions, the strange circumstances surrounding her death. I figured maybe, just maybe, there'd be something more to discover if I kept it around. But the truth, every time it flickers to life, with that preacher's voice spouting about sin and damnation, or worse, those soft, calming words from a woman I never knew, it just makes me wonder if Teresa's spirit or something else is still tied to it. I've had friends tell me that I should get rid of the whole collection, museum as I call it now, before something worse happens. But I can't, not out of fear, but because it feels like these items, these relics of people's lives, need to be remembered. Even if no one else cares, I suppose it's a way for me to keep a piece of them alive, to give meaning to the chaos they left behind. And while the radio hasn't done anything as dramatic as that first screeching episode in a while, it's always there, that crackle, that subtle hum, when everything else is quiet. It reminds me that I'm not just clearing out junk. I'm piecing together lives, unraveling stories that no one else may ever hear. So that's the story of Teresa. It was my first big job, and one that marked the beginning of a strange path I've been walking ever since. If anyone's curious about more of the stories I've gathered, well, I've got plenty. From the seemingly mundane to the downright bizarre, there's no shortage of secrets buried in the clutter of people's lives. And hey, if the radio kicks on again tonight with one of those fire and brimstone sermons, I might just listen. After all, I've learned that sometimes the strangest things have the most to teach us. I had to pause after reading that entry. It was one thing to go through Alan's journals from the early days when he was struggling with delusions and hallucinations following the deaths of his loved ones. Back then, his mind was fractured, fragile, and desperate for some kind of solace in the face of all that tragedy. But this was something else. Years of recovery, a family of his own, and now this resurgence of the black-eyed figures. What struck me most wasn't just the terror of seeing his daughters at the door, calling to him with those same voices, but how that encounter reopened something he had buried deep. I've read enough accounts of strange phenomena to know that this wasn't just a random nightmare. His description of the girls, their eyes, and the overwhelming fear that gripped him all pointed to something more. The rational side of me wanted to chalk it up to the stress of fatherhood, the pressures of life, or even some leftover trauma from his earlier years. But the way he wrote, the sheer panic in his words, it felt too real, too immediate to be brushed off as another delusion. Alan had spent over a decade rebuilding his life. His journal detailed how he overcame immense grief, guilt, and the hallucinations that had plagued him after his family's deaths. He'd found happiness again with his wife, Rosie, and their children. He'd built a stable life, far removed from the chaos of his youth. But now all of that seemed to be in jeopardy. I couldn't help but feel for him. He must have been terrified, not just because of what he saw, but because of what it represented. If the black-eyed figures were real, then everything he'd worked so hard to believe, that his mind had been healed, that he wasn't crazy, was falling apart. And if they weren't real, then it meant the hallucinations were back, creeping into his life when he least expected it. The journal entries that followed this one were short, erratic. Alan wrote about sleepless nights, how he started keeping the house locked up tight after dark, and how every time he heard a knock on the door, his heart would race. There was no longer any mention of stargazing with his telescope or tucking his kids in at night. It was as if a cloud of dread had settled over his home, and he was just waiting for the other shoe to drop. The next entry that stood out was from a few weeks later. Dear Journal, it happened again last night. This time it wasn't just the girls. Rosie and I were watching TV when there was a knock at the door. It was late, maybe around 11. I didn't want to answer it. Not after last time, but Rosie insisted. She said I was being paranoid, that it was probably just someone who needed help, maybe one of the neighbors. I didn't want to scare her, so I opened the door, praying it would just be a lost traveler or something. But no, there he was. It was the boy. The same one I'd seen all those years ago. The one I'd convinced myself was just a hallucination, a product of my trauma. He was standing there, staring up at me with those same black eyes. He didn't say anything at first, just stood there, silent. Rosie was right behind me, and I felt her hand on my arm, probably wondering why I wasn't saying anything. And then he spoke. "Can I come in?" he asked, in that same eerie, emotionless voice I remembered from before. I slammed the door in his face without a second thought, locking it, bolting it, doing whatever I could to keep him out. Rosie was yelling at me, asking what the hell was going on, but I couldn't explain it. How do you tell someone that the figure from your deepest nightmares is standing on your front porch? I didn't sleep that night. Every little nose made me jump. I kept expecting to hear another knock, to see those black eyes staring through the windows. But the boy didn't come back, not that night. Anyway, Alan's writing became more fragmented after that. He stopped journaling about his family altogether and focused solely on the black-eyed figures. He was convinced they were targeting him, that they were somehow connected to the tragedies in his past. His entries were filled with paranoia, each one shorter and more erratic than the last. The final entry I read was almost illegible. "Dear Journal, they won't stop. They keep knocking, asking to come in. I can't let them in. I won't, but they're getting louder. I'm not sure how much longer I can keep them out. All I know is that whatever those figures were, they had haunted him for decades. And in the end, they won." This was the turning point for Alan. His desperation was palpable as I read through those final entries. He'd been strong, or at least he had tried to be, for so long. The journal entries revealed a man who was doing everything he could to protect his family, even as he felt himself unraveling. But when the demons started directly interacting with his children, taking his son's hand, playing games with his daughters, Alan knew he was out of options. He had lost control over his home, his safe space, and worst of all, over himself. His perception of reality had become so warped that he could no longer trust his own mind. Were his daughters safe? Were they really his daughters at all, or had the black-eyed children already taken them? The fear of losing them, or worse, of being the one to hurt them, became all-consuming. I found it chilling how Alan acknowledged this possibility in his last journal entry. "Dear Journal, I'm afraid I'm running out of time. The nightmares are getting worse. Every night I see them, my own kids, their eyes black as coal, dragging me out of bed, holding me down, making me watch as they do things, unspeakable things to Rosie and Charlie. I don't know if I can trust myself anymore. I'm terrified I'll wake up one day and it won't just be a nightmare. What if I lose control? What if it's me who hurts them? I don't want to be that man. I can't be that man. My family deserves better. But I don't know how much longer I can fight this. I've started locking myself in the basement at night just in case, if I do something. I want to make sure it's to me and not them." That was the last coherent entry before the writing devolved into rambling. Alan's entries became scattered, disjointed thoughts, bits and pieces of nightmares, regrets, and overwhelming guilt. He stopped referring to the black-eyed children as something external, and began speaking as though they were a part of him, his thoughts, his urges, his fears. His final words, written in shaky handwriting on the last page, sent a chill down my spine. I can't protect them anymore. They're already here, God forgive me. After that the journal abruptly ended. There were no more entries, no further explanations. The man who had poured his heart and soul into documenting his struggles had gone silent. I couldn't help but feel a profound sense of sadness and dread. Alan had been fighting for so long for his sanity, for his family, and in the end, it seemed like the darkness had won. Whether it was the black-eyed children or his own deteriorating mental state, something had finally broken him. But the most unsettling part, I still didn't know what had happened to him or his family. The journals were my only link to Alan's fate, and they offered no closure. For days after finishing the last entry, I couldn't stop thinking about him. Was he still out there, somewhere, or had the black-eyed children finally claimed him? At first I thought Kim's Lake House would be a straightforward job, just another property to clear out and catalog. But the more time I spent there, the more I began to feel unsettled. There was nothing particularly off-putting about the house at first glance. In fact, it was quite charming. The lakefront view was beautiful, and the house was well kept, even cozy. But there was something beneath the surface, something I couldn't quite put my finger on. The first strange thing happened when I went into one of the guest bedrooms to clear out some old magazines and empty the closet. As I started boxing up what looked like old fishing gear and board games, I caught a whiff of something strange. It wasn't the typical musty smell of a lake house. This was sharp, metallic, like pennies or rust. I figure it might have been some old tools or forgotten camping gear that had been left damp and was now corroding. But I didn't see anything out of the ordinary. Later, as I was organizing the items I'd set aside, I noticed something odd about the pacifier with the butterfly pattern. It was so specific, and it didn't seem like something a family with older children would have lying around. I remembered the family mentioning that none of Kim's children had infants, at least not recently. I dismissed it at first, thinking maybe it was from a previous Airbnb guest, or perhaps someone had brought a baby along during a family gathering and left it behind. Still, it didn't sit right with me. I tried to shake off the weird feeling as I continued my work. That evening, I took a break on the porch to watch the sunset over the lake. The water was calm, reflecting the fading pinks and oranges of the sky. It was peaceful, at least. It should have been. But as I stood there, taking in the view, I felt this overwhelming sensation that I was being watched. The hair on the back of my neck prickled, and my skin crawled with unease. I scanned the area, expecting to see someone on the other side of the lake, or maybe a boat drifting in the distance. But there was no one. The only sound was the gentle lapping of the water against the shore. Shaking it off as nothing more than fatigue, I went back inside. I tried to focus on finishing up for the day, boxing more items for donation, trash, and sorting things that seemed sentimental to the family. That's when I found the journal. Tucked away in the bottom drawer of Kim's bedside table was a small leather-bound journal. The edges were worn, and it had that smell that old books get after years of being forgotten. It wasn't unusual to find personal journals or letters and cleaning out properties like this, but something about this one made me pause. Maybe it was the fact that it had been tucked away so carefully, as if hidden on purpose. Curiosity got the better of me, and I sat down to flip through it. Most of the entries were what you'd expect: notes about family gatherings, trips to the lake, even some musings about the weather or her favorite recipes. But then, as I got further along, the tone of the writing began to shift. Kim started mentioning strange occurrences: lights flickering, hearing footsteps when no one was around, a constant feeling of being watched when she was alone at the lake house. One entry in particular stopped me cold. April 12th. I saw her again today. The little girl by the water. She was standing near the dock, just staring at the house. She didn't move, didn't wave, didn't speak. I called out to her, but she didn't respond. When I went down to check, she was gone, but the air by the water was freezing colder than it should have been for this time of year. I don't know who she is, but I've seen her before. I think she's trying to tell me something. I felt a chill run down my spine as I read the entry. A little girl by the water. Could that have something to do with the pacifier I'd found? I wasn't sure, but the pieces were starting to fit together in a way that made me uneasy. I wanted to keep reading, but just as I was about to turn the page, I heard a noise. It was soft at first, like a gentle tapping, but it grew louder, more insistent. It sounded like ... knocking, not on the door, but from inside the house, from the walls. At first, I thought maybe it was just the old house settling, or maybe a branch tapping against a window. But as I stood there, listening, the knocking continued, steady, rhythmic, coming from the wall near the kitchen. My heart started to race. I didn't know what was going on, but I suddenly felt very, very alone. I grabbed my things and left the house as quickly as I could, locking the door behind me. As I stood outside, trying to catch my breath, I glanced back at the lake. The water was calm, but I couldn't shake the feeling that someone or something was watching me. I decided to call it a day and head home, but I knew I'd have to come back to finish the job. And when I did, I wasn't sure what else I might find. As I continued thumbing through the ledger, my curiosity deepened. This deer, or whatever it was, had left an impression on nearly every guest who'd stayed at the cabin over the years. What had seemed at first like a harmless local animal had quickly become something far more peculiar. Its appearance in multiple reviews, spanning years, with detailed descriptions of its odd behaviors and physical traits, made me uneasy. The entries began to paint a picture that I couldn't ignore. August 14th, 17. We had such a relaxing time here at the lake house. Our kids loved watching the deer from the porch, especially the one they called Magic. They said it looked like it could talk to them, which I'm sure was just their imaginations running wild. But they were so captivated. The deer would come right up to the edge of the yard and just stare at us. I've never seen an animal act like that before, almost like it was studying us. It was a little unsettling, to be honest, but I guess it's just used to people. Still, we had a wonderful time, 5 stars again, with the deer. Every time someone mentioned it, it seemed to be acting a little stranger. I couldn't shake the feeling that there was more going on here than just a tame animal. Then I found the last entry about the deer, July 30th, 29. We stayed here for a family reunion, and it was mostly great. Beautiful spot, clean house, plenty of room for everyone. But the deer ... there was something wrong with them. At first we thought it was cute how close they came to the house, but by the second night it felt like they were surrounding us. We'd go outside and find them standing at the edge of the trees, not moving, not eating, just ... watching. My wife wouldn't let the kids go outside after dark because of how weird it got. One of the deer, this big buck with a scar, kept getting closer and closer to the house every night, until one evening we saw it standing on the dock, staring into the cabin like it wanted to come inside. We closed all the curtains and stayed inside after that. The next morning, we found hoof prints all around the porch. I swear it was trying to get in. 3 stars. That review made the hair on the back of my neck stand on end. Hoof prints around the house. A deer trying to get inside. This wasn't normal. Not even close. I sat back in the recliner, my mind racing. The more I read, the more this cabin and the deer seemed like something out of a horror movie. I thought about Kim's journal the entries about the little girl by the water, and now these strange stories about the deer with the pentagram-shaped scar. The two things seemed unrelated at first, but now I wasn't so sure. There was something tying all of this together, something Kim hadn't been able to explain before her death. I closed the ledger and set it aside, feeling unsettled. The air in the cabin felt heavier, and the shadows seemed to stretch longer than they should. I had a sudden urge to leave, to get out of the house and back to the safety of my car, but I knew I still had work to do. If I left now, I'd just have to come back. Taking a deep breath, I decided to focus on something else, anything else. I grabbed the box of sentimental items I'd collected and started organizing them again. The pacifier, the jersey, the poppet, and the skull earrings were all placed neatly in the box. But then I noticed something that made my heart skip a beat. The vanity plate I'd found, the one with the rainbow lettering, wasn't where I had left it. I knew I'd put it in the box with the other items. I remembered handling it, seeing the bright colors and tossing it in with the rest. But now it was gone. A chill ran down my spine. I stood up, looking around the room, half expecting to see the plate lying somewhere nearby, maybe having fallen out, but it was nowhere in sight. It hadn't fallen, and it hadn't been misplaced. Someone or something had moved it. At that moment, the cabin no longer felt cozy. It felt like I wasn't alone. I grabbed my bag and keys, my heart pounding in my chest, and made a beeline for the door. As I stepped outside, the cool evening air hit my face, and I felt a little relief. But the unease lingered. The sun was setting over the lake, casting long shadows across the water, and in the distance, I thought I saw movement by the trees, a deer standing perfectly still, watching me. It had a scar on its back. I didn't wait to see if it moved closer. I got in my car, started the engine, and drove away from Kim's lake house as fast as I could, vowing to never come back alone again. There was something deeply wrong with that place, something Kim knew, and maybe even her family knew, but had never spoken about. Whatever was happening there, it wasn't just a peaceful lake getaway. And whatever that deer was, it wasn't just an animal. The deer stood on the porch, staring up at the spot where the wind chime had been hanging just a short while ago. Its dark, unnatural horns gleamed in the moonlight, and the raw, jagged pentagram scar on its flank pulsed as if freshly etched. I felt a shiver crawl down my spine as I realized that it wasn't just here by coincidence. It knew the wind chime had been taken down. It knew I had taken it down. I stayed frozen at the window, my breath shallow, hoping the deer hadn't noticed me yet. But then it slowly turned its head, its unnervingly sharp gaze locking directly onto the window where I was standing. The eyes, those coat-like eyes with the strange horizontal pupils bored into me, as if sizing me up, deciding whether I was a threat or prey. For a long, horrifying moment, we just stared at each other. My heart pounded so loud I was sure the deer could hear it. I felt a cold sweat break out on the back of my neck as it shifted its weight, the wooden planks of the porch creaking under its hooves. It took another step forward, closer to the door, closer to me. That's when I remembered the wind chime. Maybe it really was some kind of protection, just like that one review had suggested. Maybe it was the only thing keeping whatever force was controlling this deer at bay. Without thinking, I bolted to the table where I had left it, my hands fumbling with the hooks and strings. The wind chime rattled angrily in my grasp as I lifted it, the evil eyes dangling and swinging wildly. The front door creaked, and I whipped around to see the deer press its snout against the wood, sniffing as if testing a barrier between us. Its nostrils flared, and for a moment I was terrified that it would push the door open. I didn't know if it had the strength to force its way in, but I wasn't about to find out. With trembling hands, I grabbed the small footstool I'd used earlier, placing it under the spot where the wind chime had hung. Climbing up quickly, I hooked the wind chime back into place, its metallic cylinders and gemstones clinking softly. As soon as it was secured, I felt an odd shift in the air, like a pressure lifting. The strange sense of dread that had been creeping up on me ebbed slightly. I heard a low, rumbling growl from outside. I jumped down from the stool and rushed back to the window to see the deer standing completely still at the top of the steps. It was glaring up at the wind chime, its body tense, as if it was about to charge. But something seemed to be holding it back. For what felt like an eternity, the deer remained there, its eerie gaze fixed on the wind chime. Then, slowly, it turned its head back toward me, its coat-like eyes narrowing in what I could only describe as rage. It pawed at the porch one last time, the fur around its hooves brushing the wood like a broom, before it slowly backed down the steps and disappeared into the dark forest. I let out a shaky breath, collapsing into one of the chairs by the door. My whole body was trembling, my mind racing to process what had just happened. It wasn't just the deer, it was the forest, it was the cabin. There was something wrong with this entire place, something dark and ancient that had seeped into the land and taken root. I didn't want to stay another minute. I needed to leave. I stood up, grabbed my bag, and began throwing my things into it. I didn't care about finishing the job anymore. Kim's family could sort through the rest on their own. I just needed to get out of there, and fast. As I made my way toward the door, I glanced one last time at the wind chime. The evil eyes swayed gently, their blue irises catching the dim light. There was something about them, something unsettling, yet protective, that made me hesitate. I wasn't sure what to do. Should I leave the wind chime there, where it had been for who knows how long, or take it with me? If it really was some kind of charm, maybe I should bring it, in case whatever force that had taken hold of the deer followed me. But what if it was only effective here, at the cabin? What if taking it would make things worse? I stood there torn, until a sudden noise from outside snapped me out of my thoughts. It sounded like something moving through the underbrush, something large. My heart rate skyrocketed again. I didn't have time to debate. I grabbed the door handle, threw it open, and ran out to my car, glancing only briefly toward the tree line as I did. For a moment, I thought I saw a figure standing among the trees, watching me. It was small, child-sized, just like the figure mentioned in the warning review. But when I blinked, it was gone, swallowed by the darkness. I didn't look back again. I jumped into my car, started the engine, and sped away from Kim's lake house, my headlights cutting through the dense night as I drove down the winding road. The further I got from the cabin, the lighter the air seemed to feel, and by the time I reached the main highway, the suffocating pressure in my chest had finally eased. But I knew I wasn't done with this place. Whatever was happening at that cabin, whatever dark force was out there, it wasn't going to be contained by the wind chime forever. And as much as I hated the idea, I had a sinking feeling that I would have to return, not just to finish Kim's affairs, but to find out what was truly hiding in those woods. The tension of that night lingered with me long after I drove away from the cabin, like a shadow refusing to let go. My heart still raced when I thought about the deer, the grotesque transformation, the sharp grin. It felt like a twisted memory, one that blurred the line between reality and nightmare. At home, the wind chime hung by the door, a constant reminder of the horrors that had transpired. I kept it there for protection, as if its presence could ward off whatever darkness lingered beyond my threshold. Every time I heard it chime in the wind, a shiver ran down my spine. But I convinced myself it was better to have it close than to risk unleashing its fury again. In the weeks that followed, The news circulated about the family who bought the cabin. They seemed blissfully unaware of the haunting history, but I couldn't shake the feeling that they were stepping into something far beyond their comprehension. I heard rumors about strange occurrences, disappearances of pets, children complaining of nightmares, and the eerie feeling of being watched. It all echoed back to that sinister deer, and I hoped they would leave before it turned into something worse. The ledger became my solace, a record of the lives that had touched that place. Each review told a story, a glimpse into joy and horror intermingled, all tied together by that wretched forest. I had put it on display in my makeshift museum, a testament to what I had endured and the twisted tales I had uncovered. Every visitor who saw it was drawn in, fascinated by the mundane transforming into the macabre. But only I knew the true weight behind the words, the fear hidden between the lines. As time passed, the nightmares receded, replaced by the mundane rhythms of life. I buried myself in my work, focusing on the objects I had collected, the stories they told. Yet, every so often, I'd find myself jolted awake in the dead of night, cold sweat clinging to my skin, haunted by the image of that deer grinning at me. Those were the nights I'd sit up, staring at the wind chime, the moonlight casting eerie shadows through my window. I began to wonder if I'd ever truly escaped the grip of that place. Was the wind chime really a protector, or had it become a tether, binding me to the horrors I thought I had left behind? I started to keep a closer eye on my dream catchers, rearranging them in the hopes they'd catch any remnants of fear and despair before they could take root in my mind. Sometimes I'd go through the old reviews in the ledger, searching for clues or hints about the deer, the forest, anything that could help me understand. I came across entries that spoke of local legends, stories of spirits residing within the trees, of animals cursed to protect the secrets of the woods. One particularly chilling account recounted a family who had tried to capture the deer, only to vanish without a trace. Those tales made my skin crawl, yet they also sparked a burning curiosity. I couldn't help but wonder what had happened to the kid who went missing after the house was sold. Had they wandered too close to the woods? Did they encounter the same twisted creature I had? I felt an unsettling sense of responsibility, as if I hadn't done enough to warn the world about the darkness that lurked beneath the surface of that idyllic retreat. Despite the unease, I found myself yearning for the thrill of uncovering more stories, diving deeper into the shadows that had once threatened to consume me. I started attending local folklore gatherings, listening to the whispers of old tales and legends. Each story reminded me of that fateful night, and I couldn't help but share my own, carefully omitting the most horrifying details, while still imparting the gravity of what I had experienced. My connection to the wind chime deepened, and in an odd way, it became a part of my identity. I was the curator of the strange and unusual, the keeper of stories that skirted the edges of reality. And while the nightmares still crept back occasionally, I embraced them as a part of my journey, a reminder of the boundaries between light and dark. I learned to appreciate the calm that followed the storm, the moments when the wind would catch the chimes just right, filling my home with a soft, melodic sound. It felt like a dance with fate, a reminder that though darkness may linger, there was also light, beauty, and resilience. I'd face the terror head-on and come out the other side, ready to embrace whatever came next, armed with my stories and my wind chime. I always enjoy walking home from a late shift at the coffee shop. The quiet streets and cool night air helped me relax after a long day. There's something peaceful about the city at night, the buildings bathed in the light of the street lamps, while I hear the distant hum of traffic and the occasional rustle of leaves in the pleasant breeze. I often walked at a leisurely pace and enjoyed these moments of solitude. My path took me through a small park, past a row of quaint shops, and then down a quiet residential street lined with charming old houses. It was a familiar route, one I had taken countless times without a second thought. These late-night walks had always been my time to unwind, to let the stress of the day fall away before I finally collapsed into bed. Lately, however, the sense of peace I once found in these walks has turned into a source of dread. It started with the little things. I felt the weight of unseen eyes tracking my every move as I walked my usual route. But whenever I turned around, the street was empty. At first, I brushed it off as paranoia or exhaustion. Everyone gets that strange feeling from time to time, right? One night, I noticed a car parked not far from my apartment. It wasn't unusual for cars to be there, but something about this one made me uneasy. It was always the same car, and it appeared every time I left for work, and was still there when I came back. I tried to explain it away. Maybe it belonged to someone in the neighborhood. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that someone was watching me. The turning point came last Thursday. I was closing the cafe, the last to leave as usual. As I locked the door, I saw a shadow standing under a street light on the other side of the road. The figure didn't move, just stood there, staring in my direction. My heart raced, but I forced myself to walk calmly to my car, pretending I hadn't noticed. When I glanced in the rearview mirror, the figure was gone. The next morning, I found a note under my windshield wiper. "You look beautiful when you're scared." My blood ran cold. It wasn't just my imagination. Someone was really watching me. I reported it to the police, but they dismissed it as a prank. "Probably just some troublemaker trying to scare you," they said. But I knew it was more than that. Over the next few days, the sensation of being watched intensified. I began to notice the same person watching me from a distance. Whether I was at the grocery store, going to the post office, or even looking out my apartment window, they were there, lurking just at the edge of my field of vision. It felt as though they knew my every move. I started to isolate myself, avoiding friends and family out of fear. My sleep became restless, plagued by nightmares of being hunted. I felt a constant weight on my chest, an impending sense of doom that I couldn't escape. One night I came home to find my apartment door slightly ajar. I know I closed and locked it, didn't I? My heart pounded as I opened the door, terrified of what I might find inside. The apartment appeared untouched, but a single red rose lay on my kitchen table with another note. "I know where you sleep." Panic gripped me. I called the police again, but there was no sign of forced entry, and nothing had been stolen. It was probably just a coincidence, they told me. "Lock your door and be careful." A coincidence? How could this be a coincidence? I started seeing a therapist, hoping to find relief from the growing paranoia. But even in the safety of a professional's office, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. The therapist reassured me it was all in my head, a manifestation of stress and anxiety. But I knew better then. The cat appeared dead on my doorstep. It was a message, a threat. I packed my bags and fled to a hotel, desperate for safety. But even there, I was haunted by the feeling of being followed. I couldn't escape. No matter where I went, I knew my stalker was there, lurking in the shadows, waiting. I developed a series of obsessive habits to try to keep the fear at bay. Every night, I double-checked the locks on all my doors and windows, sometimes 3 or 4 times. Even then, I often lay awake for hours, listening for every creak and groan in the building, my heart racing with each unfamiliar sound. During the day, I avoided going out as much as possible. I began ordering groceries online and convinced my boss to let me take time off from work. When I had no choice but to leave the apartment, I moved quickly, scanning every corner for signs of danger. I wore sunglasses and a hat, trying to disguise myself. But no matter what I did, the feeling of being watched persisted. The notes kept coming. I found them under the windshield wiper, slipped into my door, tucked inside my grocery deliveries, each one more disturbing than the last. You can't hide from me. I see you. You belong to me. The handwriting was always the same, neat, precise, almost elegant. The words, however, were anything but. I changed my phone number twice, but the unknown calls continued. At first, it was just heavy breathing. Then came the whispers of my name. Now they describe in chilling detail what my stalker wants to do to me. I've stopped answering the phone, letting every call go to voicemail. But the messages are still there, waiting for me, constant reminders that I am never truly alone, that my friends and family are worried. They see the toll it's taking on me, the dark circles under my eyes, how I jump at every nose. I've tried to explain what's happening, but they don't understand. It's all in your head. You're just stressed. I started keeping a journal, documenting every encounter, every note, every phone call. It helps keep me grounded, reminding me that this nightmare is real. Sometimes I reread the entries, hoping to find a pattern I missed, but it's always the same relentless, inescapable nightmare. Last night, I was awakened by a tapping at my bedroom window. I live on the 3rd floor. There's no fire escape, no tree branches nearby. The logical part of my brain told me it was just the wind, but deep down I knew better. I lay completely still, barely breathing, until the tapping stopped. I've installed security cameras around my apartment, but they offer little comfort. I spend hours reviewing the footage, looking for any sign of my stalker. Sometimes I think I see something, a shadow moving in the background, a figure standing just out of frame, but it's always too blurry, too indistinct. I even tried staying with friends, hoping the company would make me feel safe. But the feeling of being watched never leaves. One night, while staying at my best friend's house, I found a note slipped under the door. You can't escape me. As the days blur into weeks, I feel myself unraveling. The constant fear, the sleepless nights, the overwhelming sense of being watched, it's too much. I began to experience panic attacks, my chest tightening, my breath coming in short, shallow gasps. I had a dream last night, although it felt more like a nightmare. I was walking home from the cafe, but everything was wrong. The streets were empty, the buildings were dark, and an unbearable silence hung in the air. The shadows seemed to reach out, twisting around me. I could feel eyes on me, hundreds of eyes watching, waiting. I tried to run, but my feet felt like they were sinking into the ground, moving slower and slower. I woke up drenched in sweat, my heart pounding. It took me several moments to realize I was in my apartment, that it was just a dream, but was it? I don't know how much longer I can live like this. The fear is consuming me, eating away at my sanity. I keep thinking about moving, about starting over somewhere far away, but deep down I know it wouldn't matter. My stalker would find me, no matter where I went. He's always there, always watching, always waiting. If you're reading this, please believe me. I'm not crazy. This is real. It's happening to me, and I don't know how much longer I can hold on. Fear is slowly tearing me apart. I need help. My name is Jack Lakecast, and I am a private investigator. I used to work as a sergeant in the NYPD, but after witnessing several unexplained events during my tenure, I knew I had to leave. It wasn't that I no longer loved the job. It was the strange occurrences the department refused to investigate. If they wouldn't do it, I would. What started as routine investigations turned into something far more sinister. It began with a disturbing pattern in several elite school districts across the country. These schools, known for their prestigious academic programs, had all adopted a new initiative. Every student was issued a laptop. After a few months, the laptops were returned to the school administrators, checked for any issues, and reused for the next group of students. On the surface, everything appeared normal. The laptops were in perfect working condition, but the students, well, that was a different story. The first incident I investigated occurred on December 10th, 2020. A boy in the middle of his class asked to use the washroom. His teacher, unaware of what was about to unfold, nodded and allowed him to go. But instead of walking toward the bathroom, the boy made his way to the front of the room. As he approached the teacher's desk, he took out a pen and, in a sudden, violent act, stabbed it into the teacher's throat. The classroom erupted into chaos. Blood sprayed across the desks, the walls, and onto the horrified faces of the students. They screamed, frozen in terror, as their teacher gasped and collapsed to the floor. The police were called, and I was one of the first to arrive on the scene. As I entered the room, the metallic scent of blood hit me like a wall. There was so much blood, too much for just one victim. The scene was surreal, as though multiple people had been attacked. The boy stood silently over the teacher's lifeless body, his expression unnervingly calm. He didn't resist as we took him into custody. There was no fight, no emotion, just an eerie stillness. Later, we brought him in for questioning. I was there, along with a child psychologist, Chris Parent. The boy sat across from us in the interrogation room, staring blankly at the wall. His name, which we agreed to keep anonymous due to his age, we'll call John Doe. JL. Do you know why you're here? I asked, trying to coax any response out of him. JD. Silence. CP. John, my name is Chris. I'm a psychologist, and I'm here to help you. Can you tell us what you remember? Chris leaned forward, his voice gentle. JD. More silence. The boy's eyes shifted slightly, but he remained silent. JL. John, talk to us. We can't help you if you don't say anything. At that moment, the boy began to hum a tune that was oddly familiar, chilling even. Chris and I exchanged glances, uncertain of what to make of it. CP. John, we want to understand what happened. Suddenly, the boy whispered, his voice barely audible. JD. Ring around the rosy. Ashes. Ashes. We all fall down. A shiver ran down my spine. JL. John, what do you mean by that? What happened in the classroom? JD. We all fall down. We all fall down. We all fall down. He screamed. Just then, the lights in the interrogation room flickered before plunging us into complete darkness. The only sound was the panicked breathing of the psychologist beside me. I fumbled for my flashlight, clicking it on just in time to see a dark, shadowy figure standing over John. The figure had long, blackened fingers wrapped around the boy's neck, squeezing tightly. I froze, momentarily unable to process what I was seeing. Before I could react, the figure slashed at John's throat with a sharp, claw-like hand. Blood sprayed across the room, and John's body went limp in the chair. Through the gurgling sound of his last breaths, John whispered one final time. We all fall down. I stood there, paralyzed by what I had just witnessed. The figure vanished as quickly as it had appeared, leaving only a bloody scene and a lifeless boy. The police report stated that the power outage had caused the boy to panic and harm himself. But I knew what I saw. There was something else in that room, something not human, That night I took the security footage from the interrogation room. I had to know more, had to understand what really happened. Back in the safety of my home, I plugged the USB into my computer and watched the footage. At first, everything seemed normal. John sitting there, the psychologist talking to him. But as John began to hum Ring Around the Rosie, I saw it a shadowy figure standing in the corner of the room. It wasn't a person. It was something else, something darker. As the boy screamed, "We all fall down," the figure turned toward the camera, its glowing eyes locking on to the lens. My heart raced as the figure lunged at the camera, and suddenly the screen went black. My computer shut down, and text began flashing across the screen in a haunting, repetitive message. "You all fall down." I stared at the screen, my hands trembling. Whatever this thing was, it wasn't done. I couldn't ignore it any longer. This case went far beyond any normal explanation. The students, the laptops, the eerie song, it was all connected somehow. But the deeper I dug, the more I felt the weight of something sinister pressing down on me. The next morning, I received a call. Another student had gone crazy this time. It was a girl from a different school. She had tried to claw out her own eyes, muttering the same words, "We all fall down. The nightmares are just beginning." After witnessing the disturbing footage from the interrogation room, I knew something was wrong with this case, deeply wrong. The words "we all fall down" flashed over and over on my computer screen. I slammed my laptop shut, yanked the USB from the port, and bolted out of my office. My mind raced, trying to make sense of what I had just seen. There was no logical explanation for it. My instincts screamed at me that this was no ordinary case. I needed help, and I knew just the person to call. I dialed a friend of mine, someone who had dealt with the unusual before. After listening to me carefully, she directed me to someone by the name of Lady Lanter. "She knows more about the unknown than anyone else," she said. "If anyone can help, it's her." It was 4 a.m., but I didn't care. I needed answers, and I couldn't wait for the sun to rise. I grabbed the address my friend had given me and drove straight to Lady Lanter's house. As I pulled up to the dimly lit, old brick house, unease crept into my bones. It wasn't just the eerie silence that made my skin crawl. It was the feeling that something was watching me, lurking in the darkness. I banged on the door. "Lady Lanter, this is the police. Open up." I yelled, hoping someone would answer. There was nothing but silence. I knocked again, louder this time, until the door slowly creaked open. I hesitated for a moment, peering into the darkened hallway. A gust of cold wind blew from inside, and before I could react, the door slammed shut behind me, sealing me inside. My heart pounded as I turned around, suddenly aware that I wasn't alone. A figure appeared out of the darkness, holding a lantern. The dim light flickered, casting strange shadows on the walls. It was her, Lady Lanter. Her face was pale, almost ethereal, and her eyes seemed to pierce right through me. "Lady Lanter, I know why you're here, Jack." Her voice was calm, unsettlingly so. "Your friend told me you were coming. I didn't waste time. I need help. I have this case." I began, but she cut me off with a wave of her hand. "Lines. Sit," she commanded, pointing to a wooden chair. Reluctantly, I did as she asked. As she switched on the light, my unease grew tenfold. Her house was like something out of a nightmare. Walls covered in devilish symbols, antique trinkets, and grotesque artwork. It was impossible to feel comfortable here. Lady Lanter moved toward a table and pulled out an old, leather-bound book. She opened it and slid a photograph across the table toward me. It was a picture of a young boy no more than 10 years old, sitting on a dock by a lake. There was nothing unusual about the photo at first glance. but the way she looked at me told me there was more to it. LL. To the untrained eye, this is just a photograph of a boy. But this, she paused, retrieving a crucifix from her bag. Holding it over a nearby candle flame, the fire turned an unnatural shade of purple. Then the crucifix began to bleed. Drops of blood fell onto the photograph, and what I saw next made my stomach churn. The boy's face transformed. His eyes turned a deep, bloody red, and his innocent smile twisted into the sinister grin I'd seen on John Doe. Around him, the shadow I had seen in the interrogation room grew darker, more defined. Joel. What the hell is this? LL. This is not a human bow. It is a monster one that preys on the minds of children, feeds on their purity, and twists them into instruments of darkness. This thing is far beyond anything you've dealt with before. She handed me the crucifix and lighter. Hold this to any flame, and it will reveal the truth. Before I could ask anything more, she ushered me to the door and slammed it shut behind me, the lock clicking into place. I stood there for a moment, clutching the crucifix, trying to piece together everything she had told me. It didn't make any sense, but I had no choice but to believe her. Whatever this thing was, it was hunting me now. I drove toward the station, my mind racing. I tuned the radio to distract myself, but all I got was static. I switched stations, more static. I tried again. Nothing. My grip on the steering wheel tightened, the eerie silence in the car growing heavier by the second. Suddenly, the radio crackled to life, but instead of static, I heard a faint voice like a child's. The words were soft, unintelligible at first, but they grew louder, clearer. Little girl, ring around the rosy. My blood ran cold. LG. Ashes, ashes, we all fall down. I slammed the power button, but the radio wouldn't turn off. The voice continued, her tone sweet but menacing. LG. We all fall down. Without warning, the windows of my car shattered. I swerved, pulling over to the side of the road. I jumped out, my hands shaking. But when I inspected the car, there was no sign of what had caused the impact. Yet I knew something had hit it, something powerful. Taking out the crucifix, I flicked the lighter, holding the flame close. A single drop of blood fell onto the car, and suddenly deep claw marks appeared on the side of the vehicle. Blood dripped from the scratches, and glowing words spelled out a chilling message. Fall down. My breath caught in my throat. I was being hunted, and there was no one around to help me. I scrambled back into the car, but it wouldn't start. 1, 2, 3 tries, nothing. Then I heard them whispers. They came from the side of the car, the side where the claw marks were. I tried again. 1, 2, 3 more times, still nothing. The radio came back to life. LG. We all fall down. We all fall down, fall down. I didn't know what else to do, so I followed the voice's command. I got out of the car and lay flat on the ground, clutching the crucifix. I held my breath, trying not to make a sound, as I heard footsteps approaching. Heavy, deliberate. It was the same figure I had seen in the interrogation room. Its inhuman shape moved toward me, its feet stomping against the pavement. It hummed the same eerie tune, a grotesque mockery of a nursery rhyme. The figure loomed over me, its shadow stretching as it bent down. I could feel its breath, cold and unnatural. Then, from behind it, I heard a garbage can topple over. The creature turned, distracted, and in that moment, I made my move. I bolted for the car, threw myself into the driver's seat, and jammed the key into the ignition. The engine roared to life. I slammed on the gas just as the creature lunged at the car. In my rearview mirror, I saw it swipe at the back, missing by inches. I didn't stop driving until I saw the first light of dawn break through the horizon. Only then did I pull over, my hands still trembling. I stepped out of the car, hoping to find some solace in the sunrise, but even as I stood there, breathing in the morning air, the radio crackled to life one last time. Radio static. It won't matter where you run, little piggy. I will see you tonight, ... and every night. This thing wasn't done with me, not even close. After the harrowing encounter on the road, I knew I couldn't ignore the looming threat. The cryptic words from the radio still echoed in my mind. I will see you tonight and every night. That dark figure, with its cold, unnatural presence, had marked me for something far worse. It wasn't over, not even close. Desperate for answers, I decided to investigate further, starting with the schools where these mysterious incidents had been reported. The first stop, St. Stephen's Academy. Once a symbol of elite education, the school now appeared more like a place haunted by some unseen force, with its once pristine image tainted by a cloud of darkness. Thought as I parked outside the school, the gray sky hung heavy, casting long shadows across the abandoned playground. Walking through the quiet hallways of the academy, the stillness felt wrong, as if the walls themselves were watching. The creak of the wooden floors beneath my feet echoed through the silence. The school felt lifeless, but beneath that emptiness I sensed something lurking. I made my way to the library, where I'd heard the tech equipment was stored. I pushed open the door and stepped into a room cluttered with laptops, cords, and machines. It wasn't just the disorder that unnerved me. It was the tension that seemed to hang in the air. A man was there, pacing nervously, his eyes darting around as if expecting something to leap out from the darkness. I approached him cautiously. "I'm Jack Laycast, NYPD," I said, flashing my badge. "I need to know about these laptops." He glanced at the badge and nodded, wiping his brow with a shaking hand. "It's the laptops. Something's wrong with them," he muttered, his voice strained. "What exactly do you mean?" I asked, stepping closer. "We wiped them, ran diagnostics. Everything should have been normal," he explained, but I could tell he was holding back. But then, the students started acting strange, violent, like something was controlling them. His voice trembled as he spoke. "Show me the records," I demanded, needing more than just his words. If something was happening through these machines, there had to be evidence. Reluctantly, he led me to his workstation and pulled up the logs. What I saw made my blood run cold and explained data spikes, strange glitches, and anomalies, all coinciding with the incidents. But what caught my eye the most was the time. 3:33 a.m. It appeared repeatedly, like a cursed marker. "What happens at 3:33 a.m.? I whispered, already dreading the answer. "That's when the laptops automatically update." "But this ... He hesitated, staring at the screen. "This isn't right. It's like they're accessing something, or being accessed." Before I could respond, the lights flickered, casting the room into an uneasy twilight. The computer screen distorted, static rippling across the display. Then, just like before, the timestamp flashed repeatedly. 3:33 a.m. My heart sank as I saw a face materialize on the screen, the same figure from the interrogation room. Its eyes burned with malevolence, and its twisted smile made my skin crawl. "Jack Laycast, you cannot stop this. We all fall down." The voice came from the speakers, low and menacing. Suddenly, the room plunged into darkness, and I felt a chill creep over me. I fumbled for my flashlight and clicked it on, the weak beam cutting through the inky blackness. My hands trembled as I scanned the room. Then I heard a guttural growl coming from behind me. I spun around, the flashlight beam shaking in my hand, illuminating the doorway. Standing there was the creature, his eyes glowing with a fiery hatred. Its form was more grotesque up close, its body hunched and its hands contorted into sharp claws. The man screamed, but it was too late. In one swift motion, the creature lunged at him, ripping through flesh and bone with terrifying ease. Blood splattered across the room as the man's body fell limp to the floor. Panic surged through me, but I couldn't let it paralyze me. I fumbled for the crucifix Lady Lanter had given me, clutching it tightly. With shaking hands, I held it to the lighter's flame. The purple glow returned, and I pointed it directly at the creature. The beast recoiled, hissing violently as the light burned through its shadowy form. Its eyes flickered with rage, its body twisting and warping as if trying to resist the crucifix's power. It let out a screech, backing away, but I knew this was only a temporary reprieve. Seizing the opportunity, I grabbed one of the laptops from the desk and bolted toward the door, the creature's enraged shrieks echoing behind me. My heart raced as I sprinted through the darkened hallways, the creature's presence pressing in on me, making the air feel thick and suffocating. I didn't stop until I reached my car. Throwing the laptop onto the passenger seat, I started the engine and sped away from the school. My mind still reeling from what I'd just witnessed, I glanced over at the laptop, hoping for some clue, some explanation for all of this madness. The screen lit up, and once again, the haunting message appeared. "We all fall down." My hands tightened around the steering wheel. This thing wasn't done with me. Whatever it was far from finished. The clock on my dashboard blinked, and I realized it was getting closer to 3:33 a.m. My heart pounded faster. Was this a countdown, a warning, or something worse? The laptop beeped, and I saw the timestamp flash again, 3:33 a.m. Then the radio in my car crackled to life, static filling the speakers before a voice cut through the noise. Double quotes, Jack. It's time. I gripped the crucifix tighter, knowing that no matter how far I ran, no matter how hard I tried to escape, this darkness had already claimed me, and it would follow me, night after night, until I felt just like everyone else. I glanced into the rearview mirror, and there, in the distance, I saw the figure standing motionless on the side of the road, its eyes glowing, watching me drive away. The battle wasn't over. This was only the beginning. I've always been fascinated by urban exploration. The thrill of discovering forgotten places, untouched by time, always captivated me. But this time I wasn't just looking for crumbling walls and decaying relics. This time I was searching for people. The rumors had intrigued me. An abandoned village with a derelict hospital on the outskirts where people had mysteriously vanished. I couldn't resist. With my trusty flashlight, notebook, camera, smartphone, smartwatch, medkit, and a sturdy pair of boots, I set off early one foggy morning, determined to uncover the truth. The journey took me deep into the countryside, far away from civilization. The road leading to the village was barely a path, overgrown and winding through dense trees that seemed to close in around me. When I finally arrived, the silence hit me first, not the peaceful kind, but the unsettling and natural kind. The village stood there, frozen in time, its overgrown vegetation swallowing what remained of the once vibrant community. The houses were small, dilapidated, their windows shattered, and doors hanging on rusted hinges. They stood like sentinels, their walls heavy with secrets, waiting for someone to uncover them. I started with the houses, cautiously stepping inside each one, my flashlight cutting through the darkness. Dusty furniture, faded photographs, and forgotten trinkets lay scattered in the gloom, remnants of lives that had been abruptly abandoned. I moved slowly, methodically, taking pictures, jotting down notes, immersing myself in the eerie atmosphere. Each house told its own story: a family dinner left uneaten, a child's toy sitting alone in the corner, a wedding photo framed on a cracked mantel. It was as if the village had been abandoned in a hurry, as though something had driven the people away. As I ventured deeper into the village, a growing unease settled in the pit of my stomach. Something felt off, like I wasn't alone. But it wasn't until I reached the hospital at the far edge of the village that the real terror began. The hospital loomed before me, its crumbling facade standing tall against the fog. Broken windows stared out like soulless eyes, and the door, an imposing metal frame, was slightly ajar, inviting me in. I hesitated, feeling a cold shiver crawl down my spine, but curiosity pushed me forward. I pushed the door open with a loud creak, the sound echoing ominously through the desolate corridors. The air inside was thick with the smell of mildew, decay, and something else, something metallic. My flashlight flickered as I stepped inside, its beam barely cutting through the murkiness. The hospital was massive, far bigger than it had appeared from the outside. Long corridors stretched ahead of me, each one lined with rooms that held their own decaying mysteries. I wandered through the abandoned halls, my footsteps the only sound in the oppressive silence. Rusted hospital beds, outdated medical equipment, and shattered glass littered the rooms. But it wasn't just the sight of the decay that unsettled me. It was the feeling that something was watching. Every creak, every gust of wind seemed to carry with it the weight of unseen eyes. I found myself drawn to a room marked records. The door was slightly ajar, and I couldn't help but feel a strange compulsion to enter. Inside, I found shelves stacked with old files, thick with dust and age. I picked one up at random, opening it carefully. The paper was yellowed, the ink faded. The name on the file was hard to make out, but the date was clear: 1953. I flipped through the pages, noting strange phrases, hallucinations, erratic behavior, unexplained disappearances. My smartwatch buzzed, reminding me to check my phone. Odd, I thought. I had a signal, which was strange given how remote this place was. I pulled out my phone and checked my notifications. There, in the midst of mundane messages, was a series of texts from an unknown number. "You're not alone. They see you." My heart raced. I quickly pocketed my phone and continued my search, trying to shake the creeping fear that something wasn't right. I entered another room, this one filled with old surgical equipment, still stained from decades of disuse. In the far corner, something shiny caught my eye. It was a notebook, much like my own. I picked it up, flipping through the pages. It belonged to another explorer, someone who had been here recently. The last entry was dated just a week ago, but it was the words that sent chills down my spine. "I hear whispers. Someone's following me. If you find this, leave immediately." "It's not safe." I froze. A noise came from the hallway behind me. Footsteps. I turned off my flashlight and held my breath, listening intently. The footsteps were slow, deliberate, drawing closer. I could hear them echoing down the empty hallways. My smartwatch buzzed again, the screen lighting up with a single word: "Run." Panic set in. I didn't need any more convincing. I bolted from the room, sprinting down the corridors, my breath coming in ragged gasps. The footsteps quickened, matching my pace. My heart pounded in my chest as I raced toward the exit. Not daring to look back, I burst through the front doors, the cold air hitting me like a slap in the face. But I didn't stop. I kept running, the sound of footsteps still echoing behind me. It wasn't until I reached my car that I finally dared to look back. The village stood there, silent and foreboding, its secrets still buried in the decaying walls. I jumped into my car and sped away, the tires kicking up dirt as I fled. My phone buzzed once more. Another message from the unknown number. You escaped, but not for long. I never went back to that village. Some places are meant to remain forgotten, their secrets left buried. And sometimes those secrets have a way of reaching out, even after you've tried to leave them behind. Anna, can you room the next patient? I asked, glancing out from my notes. Sure. She be in room 5. She replied, heading down the hallway. I quickly skimmed through the patient's history. Mrs. Myers had been experiencing occasional stabbing pains in her left eye and eyes that came and went. It seemed like a typical case of floaters or maybe dry eye. To be cautious, we had dilated her eyes to check for any retinal issues. Satisfied with my preliminary diagnosis, I entered the room with my laptop in hand. Mrs. Myers, it's good to meet you. I'm Dr. Ronald. It's nice to meet you too, she replied, her voice tense. She was young, sitting stiffly in the exam chair, clutching her handbag with sunglasses far too big for her face. Sorry for the sunglasses, Doc. My eyes have been really sensitive to light since yesterday. A subtle alarm went off in my head, but I brushed it aside. No worries. Why don't you tell me what's been going on with your eye? Well, it's just my left eye. It feels like there's this fog getting worse, and sometimes I get these sharp pains, almost like someone's poking my eye from the inside. I had lunch with a friend on Friday, and she had similar symptoms. Could it be pink eye or something? Let's take off those sunglasses, and I'll have a look. She removed them, revealing slightly bloodshot eyes. I examined her eyes under the slit lamp, nothing too alarming at first. Then I used a fundus lens to get a look at her retina. That's when everything went wrong. As I peered into her left eye, Mrs. Myers screamed and knocked the lens out of my hand. But what I saw in that brief moment shook me to my core. Her optic nerve was black, not just dark, but a pitch-black void that seemed to swallow any light entering it. Normally, the optic nerve has an orange hue, but hers was a pure, terrifying blackness like a miniature black hole, sucking in all light. My hands trembled as I tried to process the sight. Suddenly, Mrs. Myers screamed louder, clutching her left eye, and collapsed from the chair. Anna rushed in, and we both dropped to the floor, trying to help her. She was shaking, her voice trembling with panic. There's something moving in my eye, she wailed, her body writhing in pain. Blood started trickling between her fingers as he held her eye. But something else was happening. Something underneath her skin was moving. It forced her fingers apart. The sight was horrific, her flesh struggling against whatever was beneath. With a final blood-curdling scream, Mrs. Myers fell to the floor, convulsing. Her arms dropped, and her eye It was no longer just an eye. From the black abyss of her optic nerve, jet black, spider-like appendages burst forth. They glistened under the harsh clinic lights. Wet and slimy, writhing violently, they scratched across her face, leaving bloody marks in their wake as they desperately sought purchase on the linoleum floor. The sound of the scraping of those hideous limbs against the floor mixed with her faint, gurgling moans, creating an unbearable symphony of horror. The sight was unlike anything I had ever seen, alien, grotesque, and utterly unnatural. Anna and I bolted from the room. We left Mrs. Myers behind, twitching and surrounded by the growing pool of blood on the floor, her eye now a ghastly portal of terror. The next few hours were a blur. The police arrived, and soon after, men in black suits took over. They questioned us endlessly, separating Anna and me. They made us recount every detail, over and over, like we were stuck in a loop of the nightmare. Finally, they let us go, but only after we signed a strict non-disclosure agreement. Now I'm sitting in my bedroom, breaking that NDA. I can't stay silent. Someone needs to know. Returning to work, that's out of the question. Maybe I'll take some time off, go fishing, binge some Netflix. But first I need to take some Tylenol. This headache behind my eyes, it's killing me. I used to have nightmares when I was younger. They all followed a similar pattern: trap, bound, unable to move or scream, with a growing sense of dread. Sometimes I'd be in a car hurtling down a road, the engine roaring louder and louder, or I'd be immersed in complete darkness, unable to see or hear anything except static mumbling, like a broken radio. I never could make out the words. My mom died during childbirth, and I think those nightmares were my mind's way of processing her absence. My dad found his own way of dealing with it, usually at the bottom of a bottle. He was never cruel or abusive, but he carried a quiet sadness that weighed on both of us. He wasn't much for talking, so we spent a lot of time on the road for his job. Along the way, he homeschooled me with impromptu lessons on math, history, or whatever he could think of during our long drives. When I was 17, my dad finally found a job that meant we didn't have to keep moving. It was the first time we had a permanent home, one that didn't have wheels. I picked up a job as a paper boy and started taking online courses, eventually working my way into the police academy. No one could believe it when I was accepted, not even my dad. That's how I came across the Bourne tapes. It was my 3rd month on the force, and I'd been assigned to shadow Detective Crawford. He was pushing 60, but was sharper than anyone I'd ever met. His wit and experience were the cornerstones of the crime scene investigation team. He was tough, strict, and didn't sugarcoat anything, which I appreciated. For weeks, my job had been fetching his coffee at 6 a.m. and converting his scribbled notes into Word documents. But that changed one quiet afternoon. Crawford dropped an old, scratched-up camera on my desk. "What's this?" I asked, turning it over in my hands. "Work," he said. "Right, but what kind of work?" Crawford sighed. "Plug it into your computer and watch the recordings. We've had this for a couple of years now. Some guy picked it up at a flea market and handed it in to us. The case led nowhere, so I like to give it to the new guys, see if they can spot something we missed." The word "born" was scratched into the side of the camera. I shrugged, plugged it into the computer, and clicked on the first video file. The first video was titled Meal. It lasted about a minute and was shot from a first-person perspective. The person filming was sitting in a dingy cafe, and a waitress placed a coffee and 4 slices of toast on the table. The camera shifted, and you could see the person's hands grimy and covered in dirt. They picked up a slice of toast, tore off the crust, and placed it neatly on the plate. What was weird, though, was that they slid the plate across the table to the empty seat across from them. The camera stayed fixed on that empty seat for a solid 10 seconds before the person reached out and patted the seat gently, almost as if comforting someone. The video ended abruptly. The second video was titled Lucky. This one was only 12 seconds long. The camera was set up like a dash cam, pointed out the windshield of a car. In the shot, a man and a woman were crossing the street, pushing a stroller with a baby inside. They passed by the car without incident, but the way the camera stayed fixed on the family as they walked out of view left me feeling unsettled. There was nothing else, just a strange, lingering gaze on an ordinary family. The third video was labeled Prophecy. This one was longer, about a minute. The camera was positioned behind a cracked, dusty window, looking out at a field of wheat. The glass was grimy, but you could still make out the landscape. After a while, a figure shuffled into view, The person was dressed in an oversized white gown, so large that the sleeves covered their hands and nearly brushed the ground. Their face was painted like a clown-thick white makeup, dark black eyeshadow that made their eyes look like black holes, and bright red lipstick that curled into a chilling smile. Two garish circles of pink blush stood out on their pale cheeks. Their long blonde hair was unnaturally bright, curling around their shoulders. They just stood there, staring at the camera, their hands clasped, or rather, their sleeves together in front of them. After about 30 seconds, they made a motion like they were cradling a baby, gently rocking back and forth. Then they walked out of frame. I could hear the sound of a door creaking open off-screen before the video abruptly ended. By the time I finished watching the third video, my skin was crawling. None of these videos made any sense. There was no clear context, no story being told, just unsettling fragments of someone's life, or maybe someone's delusion. I sat back in my chair, trying to shake off the growing sense of unease. I turned to Crawford, who was busy with paperwork across the room. "What am I supposed to be looking for?" I asked. He didn't even look up from his work. "If I knew that, I wouldn't have given it to you," he said dryly. "Just keep digging." I went back to the files. There were dozens of them, each with equally cryptic titles. Mother, Waiting, The End. I watched a few more, but none of them seemed to connect to anything real. It was like I was looking at a puzzle where half the pieces were missing. As the days went on, I started watching them in my free time at home, in the office, anywhere I could. There was something about those tapes that got under my skin, and the more I watched, the more I noticed small, repeating details, objects in the background, the same hands appearing in different videos, and that same eerie clown-like figure standing just out of frame in a few of them. One night, as I was going through the tapes again, I noticed something I hadn't before. In the background of the prophecy video, barely visible through the grime on the window, was a reflection. It was faint, but there was definitely someone standing behind the camera, someone watching. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up as I paused the video and zoomed in on the reflection. It was blurry, indistinct, but I could make out enough to see that whoever or whatever it was, they were wearing that same grotesque white gown, and they were smiling. That's when I realized the person behind the camera wasn't filming something innocent. They were part of whatever sick game was being played. And I wasn't just watching the tapes anymore. The tapes were watching me. File 4 was titled Storm. It ran for 9 minutes and was again shot from the first-person perspective, much like the previous videos. The first 4 minutes were shot from the same window scene in Prophecy. The rain hammered against the glass, the force of the storm almost threatening to shatter it. Although the scene was shot at night, you could make out the storm clouds flashing white in the distance, followed by deep rumbling thunder. Through the entire video, a baby cried softly in the background, its wails a steady undercurrent to the storm's fury. The person filming eventually turned away from the window, revealing a makeshift bed. The baby was swaddled in a brown coat that looked suspiciously like the one from Meal. The camera zoomed in, focusing on the baby's tear-streaked face, red from crying, with snot running down its nose. It screamed, tiny fists clenched as it struggled in its makeshift bed. The person filming made a tutting sound, walked over to the window, and picked up a brown teddy bear from a pram. They handed the toy to the baby, who took it but continued to cry. Without warning, the person filming yelled, the loudness startling even me as I watch from the safety of my desk. They stomped out of the room, slamming the door behind them. The camera followed them into what looked like a cramped, dingy bedroom. A yellow-stained mattress lay in the middle of the room, surrounded by empty beer bottles. On the bed, a blonde wig sat haphazardly beside an open Bible. The The person filming walked over, picked up the Bible carefully, and placed it on the bedside table before cutting the recording. The final video was titled Becoming a Man. This one began with the person sitting on the bed, legs crossed, the camera fixed on their lap. The door to the previous room, the one with the baby, was open. The camera shifted, and I could see the baby still clutching the teddy bear. Now sleeping soundly, the person filming stood up, walking toward the baby. They made the same tutting sound as before, wagging a grimy finger in front of the sleeping child. The baby stirred and started to cry again as the person snatched the bear from its tiny hands. The camera zoomed in on the baby's face as it erupted into tears, red and helpless. What happened next chilled me. The person filming slammed their fist on the table, then pointed at the baby in a gesture of scorn. They kept their finger extended as they backed out of the room, exiting into the open air. The camera turned to reveal a dense, wooded area outside the small house. Without hesitation, they hurled the teddy bear into the forest, letting it disappear into the trees before returning inside. The baby's cries had escalated into desperate wails, but the person ignored them. They grabbed a beer bottle from the bedroom floor, walked back to the baby, and offered it to the child, who swatted it away. The bottle shattered on the floor, sending glass skittering across the tiles. The camera swayed from side to side as if the person was shaking their head in disapproval. They tutted again, calmly scooped up the shards of glass, and placed them beside the brown coat. The video ended. By the time I finished watching the last file, my stomach was twisted in knots. I stared at the dark screen, feeling a wave of disgust wash over me. What had I just witnessed? Who had filmed those tapes? The baby wasn't kidnapped. It had to be. There was no other explanation for how that child was treated. And what was with the title of lucky for that earlier family crossing the street? Had they been chosen to escape whatever nightmare was depicted in the tapes? And the figure in asterisk prophecy. Asterisk, was that supposed to be some kind of guardian, or was it part of a sick delusion? I had more questions than answers, and I didn't like any of the conclusions my mind was drawing. When I got home at night, my dad was waiting for me at the door. "Hey, champ, how was work?" he asked with his usual tired smile. "It was fine," I muttered, brushing past him. "Doesn't sound fine to me," he said, raising an eyebrow. "Just one of the cases got to me," I admitted, not wanting to get into specifics. "Well, I got just the thing to take your mind off it," he grinned mischievously. "There's a box of my old stuff upstairs. It's been waiting all day for someone to move it. Really, you couldn't do that yourself." I groaned, rolling my eyes. "Hey, I move boxes for a living. Why would I do it for free?" He joked, chuckling to himself. I sighed and made my way upstairs to his bedroom. The box was sitting on the bed just as he'd said. As I picked it up, a tennis ball rolled out from the top, bouncing onto the floor and disappearing under the bed. Grumbling to myself, I bent down to grab the ball, but something caught an old box tucked into the corner under the bed. Curious, I pulled it out. Inside was a pile of cameras. My heart skipped a beat. I picked up one of the cameras and flipped it over in my hands. Scratched into the side were the words "road trip." My hands shook, my mouth went dry. It looked exactly like the camera Detective Crawford had handed me, the Bourne camera. Questions raced through my mind. Why was this here? How did it end up in my dad's possession? And what was on it? My legs felt weak, but I managed to slip the camera into my pocket before heading downstairs. I couldn't ask my dad about it. Not yet. Not until I knew what was on that tape. My mind was racing, heart pounding in my chest. I sat in the dimly lit parking lot outside the police station, gripping the steering wheel so hard my knuckles turned white. The night air felt suffocating as the weight of what I'd just witnessed bore down on me. Why did my dad have this camera? Could he really be involved in something so horrific? No, it couldn't be him. There had to be some other explanation. I couldn't go back home, not yet. Forcing myself out of the car, I headed inside the empty station and quickly plugged the road trip camera into my computer. As the files loaded, I saw there were 5 more videos. My hands trembled as I hovered the mouse over the first file titled Warning. The moment I clicked play, a figure shuffled into frame, wearing the same disturbing costume from the prophecy video. The camera was set up to face the door of a shed, its wooden structure visible in the background. The figure stood in the doorway, the darkness outside barely concealing the trees behind them. Their hands were clasped together just like in the previous videos. They just stood there, silent and unmoving, for a full 2 minutes. The air in the video felt as oppressive as the silence in the station around me. Just as the tension became unbearable, the figure stepped inside the shed and approached the camera. Their steps were slow, deliberate, and unnerving, but then something unexpected happened. The forest outside lit up with the flashing red and blue lights of police cars, briefly illuminating the inside of the shed. The figure broke into a sprint toward the camera, the sudden movement jolting me in my seat. They picked up the camera, causing the frame to jerk wildly. As the video steadied, it panned toward the baby, still crying, swaddled in that grimy brown coat from before. The camera then moved to the doorway, showing the lights still flashing in the woods. The figure made the sign of the cross, and the video abruptly ended as they picked up the baby and headed for the door. My heart sank. I felt sick to my core. Why did my dad have this? Tears welled up in my eyes as I grappled with the growing horror. My mind tried to reason with itself. Maybe he just bought these at a flea market, like how the Bourne tapes were found. Maybe this was all some twisted coincidence. But no matter how hard I tried to convince myself, the nagging suspicion wouldn't let go. I wiped my eyes, clicked on the next file. Proud, the screen flickered to life, showing a dark room lit only by the faint glow of a motel lamp. The camera was positioned just inside an open door, facing the room beyond. Sitting on the edge of a motel bed was a boy no older than 8, maybe younger. His legs dangled off the side, and he was staring blankly at the floor. I couldn't breathe. The boy was me. I stared at the screen, my mind reeling. There was no mistaking it. I recognized the old, faded wallpaper behind me, the ugly floral print on the bedspread. I remembered that room. We had stayed there during one of Dad's long-haul trips. Years ago, the camera zoomed in slowly, capturing every detail of the moment. I watched myself sit there, silent, expressionless, completely unaware of the camera's presence. Then the video cut off. I sat there frozen, unable to move, as the reality of what I had just seen hit me. This wasn't just some random set of tapes. This was personal. This was my life. But why? What had my dad been involved in? How long had he been hiding this from me? My stomach churned, and I felt like I was about to be sick. I had to know the truth. I couldn't just sit there and let the fear consume me. I needed to get the rest of those cameras from under his bed. Whatever was on them, whatever secrets they held, I had to face them. I remember crying, "No, no, 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 I don't want to chase storms. Please, I don't want to spin. I don't want to spin." My voice was frantic, trembling with the panic only a child could feel. My dad knelt down, putting a hand on my shoulder. Hey, it's okay, James. Don't worry. If you stay with me, I promise you won't end up like those people. I don't know why I trusted him then, but now, after watching the prod file, Everything shifted. I'm seeing my memories of him in a completely different light. I shouldn't even call him my dad. I don't know what else to call him. Come to think of it, he never told me his real name. He told me my mother died in childbirth, but if my suspicions are right, that's another lie. He abducted me. That's the only explanation that fits. I had 3 more files left on the road trip camera, and I needed to watch them. It was late, and Detective Crawford wasn't answering my calls. I was alone at the station, but I knew I couldn't stay there forever. I told my dad I'd be back shortly, just to avoid raising any suspicion. I needed to keep things normal until I could gather enough evidence, enough proof, to bring him in. After all, who could I call for help? I was the police. When I got home, the house was dark. It felt like a relief, like I wouldn't have to face him if he was asleep. I locked the door behind me and tiptoed up the stairs. His room was next to mine, and the door was shut, so I assumed he was already asleep. I quietly slipped into my room, lay down on my bed, and flipped open the camera screen. There were 3 files left to watch. File 2. Romans. The video was short, just 3 minutes long. The camera was positioned from a high vantage point, like someone was filming from a tree. Below, 3 police cars were parked on a dirt road next to a field of wheat. The officers moved frantically, running back and forth between their cars and the field, shouting into radios. They looked exhausted, sweat staining their uniforms, faces drawn with fatigue. The weirdest part, there was crying, but it wasn't the sound of a baby this time. It was the person holding the camera. The sobs were gut-wrenching, but there was no explanation for why the person was crying. The video ended abruptly, leaving more questions than answers. File 3. Visitors. This one lasted 13 minutes. The footage was shot in a motel room. The camera was positioned in a corner, aimed at a door with a large bed in the frame. After a minute, there was a knock, and a little boy, maybe 3 years old, jumped off the bed and toddled over to the door. I couldn't tell if it was me. At that age, I barely remember what I looked like, but I do know I have no recollection of this event. The boy struggled with the doorknob for a few moments, then opened it to reveal a bathroom. A leg stepped into view belonging to a man. He was dressed only in black socks, white boxers, and a red devil mask. The boy giggled, amused, as the devil danced around on all fours, making strange noises like "UG, ha-cha." But the laughter didn't last long. When the boy reached for the mask, the figure stood up suddenly, slamming the door with such force that it knocked the boy backward. He started crying, and for 6 agonizing minutes, the camera captured nothing but his sobs. Then the door creaked to open again. The figure reappeared, now dressed in a white gown far too large for him. His face was painted white, with exaggerated black eyeshadow, red lips, and bright pink circles on his cheeks. It was the same figure from the Bourne tapes. The boy cried even harder, but the figure remained calm, crouching beside him, stroking his hair, holding his hand. The boy recoiled, trying to pull away, but the figure grabbed his face and turned him toward the camera. Then, slowly, the boy stood, wiped away his tears, and walked toward the camera. He picked it up and handed it to the figure, who took it without a word. The video cut off after that. File 4. House. This one lasted 20 minutes. The video opened on the back of a man kneeling in a dark church. The space was empty, save for the rows of wooden benches and the moonlight filtering through the stained glass windows. The man was dressed all in black, his head bowed, his hands clasped in prayer. For a long time, nothing happened. The silence was suffocating. But then the man shifted, rising slowly, the sound of his feet echoing on the stone floor. He stood, still facing away from the camera, and began to turn around, Suddenly, a voice shattered the silence. "That box is still on my bed, James." I froze. My heart pounded so hard I thought it would burst from my chest. The room was pitch black, but I knew he was there, standing at the foot of my bed, staring down at me. "Sorry, Dad. I must have forgotten about it. I'll take care of it right, Ann." No. His voice was icy. "It's okay, James. Go to bed. I'll see to it." I couldn't move. I watched as he shuffled out of the room, his footsteps soft but deliberate. I didn't dare look at the camera again. I shoved it under my pillow and lay there, paralyzed with fear. He knew. He had to know. I stared at the open doorway, eyes wide, too scared to blink. I stayed like that all night, watching the darkness until the first rays of sunlight crept through the curtains. I had to get out. I had to leave. I made up an excuse about needing to go to work early. Yeah, that would work. I could get out, buy myself some time, dressed in the same clothes I wore the night before. I moved quickly, heading for the door. But as I passed his room, something made me stop. The bed was still made, just as it had been last night. The box of cameras was still sitting on top of it. But that wasn't what scared me. What terrified me was the empty space beneath the bed. The box of cameras that had been hidden there was now gone. I didn't care about making noise anymore. I bolted down the stairs, slamming into the door as I unlocked it. I didn't stop until I was in my car, speeding away from the house, from him, from whatever was coming next. I don't know where I'm going, but I know I can't go back. Not now. I finally contacted Detective Crawford. We're now officially investigating both the Bourne and road trip tapes. After the initial search of the house, my dad, or whatever I should call him, has vanished, along with the remaining cameras. Every lead feels like it's slipping through our fingers. We found a calendar with some of his handwriting, the typical things, birthdays, holidays, nothing that seemed important. But we had a graphologist take a look, and they confirmed what I feared. The handwriting on the calendar and the scratched messages on the cameras matched. He's our guy, but that's the problem. We don't know where he is. My gut churns with the sense that I've made a mistake by confronting this alone. If he knows I've been digging into his past, he might come for me to punish me for uncovering his lies. There's a darkness in him, a cold calculation I only now understand. But I can't afford to focus on that right now. We've reviewed the storm video again. There's something I hadn't noticed before. The baby's eye color, it's not mine. The realization hit me like a truck. I wasn't his first victim. He's been doing this for a long time, taking babies, creating new identities for them, and feeding them a manufactured reality. This will be my last post about the Bourne tapes. I've reached the end of the line. I don't know what's real anymore. Everything I thought was my life, my past, my identity was just a construct, something designed by him. I don't recognize myself anymore. I don't even know if I'd ever truly been me. Every step I've taken, every decision I've made, feels like it was part of his plan, part of his twisted vision for me. Even these posts, these desperate attempts to make sense of it all, feel like they might be playing into his hands. He wanted to spread his story, his ideas. Maybe this is how he does it, by manipulating people like me to spread the word of this new age, this world he's trying to create. For those of you reading this post for the first time, I'll include links to the previous updates below. But be warned, once you start down this path, it changes you. It changed me. I'm not sure I'll ever be the same. People at the office are starting to call him the visitor. No one knows much about him, but we're almost certain I was one of his victims. The theory is that he abducted me as a baby, feeding me lies about my mother dying in childbirth and taking me on the road under the guise of work. But he never told me his real name. I only ever knew him as Dad. I used to think the reason we were always on the move was because of his job, but now I see the truth he was hiding. From what, I don't know. Maybe from other victims, or from law enforcement, or maybe just from the reality he didn't want to face. We had no solid leads, just the tapes, and now they're gone. Along with him, no one has seen or heard from him since that night, the night he found me watching the house video. The house video haunts me. I can't stop thinking about it. It was so simple, so mundane in a way, but it chills me to my core. It starts in a church. The camera is fixed on the back of a man dressed all in black, kneeling in the middle of an aisle between rows of wooden benches. The only light in the room comes from the moon, seeping through the stained glass windows, casting faint colors onto the cold stone floor. For the first 10 minutes, the man doesn't move. He just kneels there, his back to the camera, motionless. Then, slowly, he begins to rise, using his hands to push himself up. He moves with difficulty, like the weight of the world is pressing down on him. As he turns to face the camera, I expect to see his face clearly, but the distance and darkness obscure his features. He spreads his arms, palms facing upward, in some kind of silent supplication, staring up toward the ceiling as if waiting for something. He holds that position for 2 minutes that feel like an eternity before lowering his hands. Then he reaches into his jacket and pulls out a slice of bread. For 4 minutes, the camera captures him eating the bread, slowly, deliberately. It's almost as if he's performing a ritual. There's no sound, but the way his face catches the moonlight suggests he's crying. Tears glisten on his cheeks as he takes small bites, staring down at his hands as if he's lost in thought. When he finished the bread, he keeps his hands in front of his face for a long moment, just staring at them. Then he reaches into his pocket again and pulls out a bottle of wine. He takes a sip, places the bottle on the floor beside him, and begins to walk along the row of benches. His footsteps echo through the empty church, growing louder and louder until, finally, he walks out of frame. But the sound doesn't stop. The footsteps continue, getting louder and closer, until finally, the camera is picked up. The video cuts off there. I can't shake the feeling that the man in the church is him, my dad, the visitor. I don't know what the ritual was about or why he recorded it, but it feels like a message for me. I'm not sure what it means, but I know one thing for sure. He's out there, he's watching, and he's waiting. The latest tape didn't attract as much attention as others, but it held the key we needed. In the video, police cars were parked along a dirt road, officers rushing between the vehicles and the nearby wheat field. The recording only lasted 2 minutes, but it was invaluable. The license plate of one of the police cars was clearly visible. Tracking down the car was relatively easy. Police departments keep detailed records of their fleet who drives which car and when. This particular car had only 4 previous drivers. We reached out to all of them, asking if they had ever been involved in any baby abduction cases in the past few years. Only one responded. The man on the other end of the call was Detective Daniel Keller. This is Detective Crawford. Who am I speaking with? Daniel Keller. Hello, Dan. May I call you Dan? You can. Okay, Dan, this conversation will be recorded for evidence in court. You are not a suspect, so don't worry. Is this okay with you? Yes, by all means. Great. So, Dan, can you tell me about your involvement in a baby abduction case a few years ago? Silence. Dan. Sorry. Yes, I can. Whenever you're ready. It was a bad case from the start. If you ask me, a bad case. Yeah, you know, the ones that feel cursed. The kind where you just know it's not going to end well. Go on. Well, It wasn't the only abduction case we were dealing with. We had another a few months before a lady's baby and prom disappeared. She said she looked away for just a second, and when she turned back, both were gone. It was as if they had vanished into thin air. We never found the baby. Dan, it's okay. Keep going. We try. God knows we try. We got so many calls from her, desperate, pleading. But what could we tell her? We lie. We kept saying she'd get her baby back soon. But then a second case opened, and that took priority. What was the second case? Another baby abduction. This time it was straight from the hospital. The mother said the staff had laid him down next to her while she rested. She was going to stay overnight. But something came. She said she woke up to crying and saw a figure. It wore a gown. Its face was stark white, and its eyes she said its eyes were like black holes. She swore it was draining her energy just by looking at her. Silence, Dan. I saw it. In the woods, just like she said. I couldn't move. It was looking at me, and I was frozen. I can't. I have to go. Wait. Dan, where are these woods? That's where the recording ended, Detective Crawford, and I wasted no time getting to the location Dan Keller had mentioned. It took us hours to reach the woods, and by then the sun was already setting. Detective Crawford, ever the professional, handed me a flashlight and began walking toward the tree line. The overgrowth was thick, making every step a struggle. Crawford muttered curses under his breath as branches and thorns caught at our clothes. Each step was deliberate, with him slicing away at the thicker branches with his pocket knife. I followed close behind, every shadow making me jump. We finally broke through to a more open section of the woods. The trees were thinner, the ground clearer. It felt untouched, as though no one had ventured this deep in years. The sun had fully set by then, plunging us into complete darkness. The only sounds were the crickets chirping and owls calling in the distance. Couldn't anyone else join us? I asked, trying to break the tension. Grow a pair, James. If you want to be a police officer, you have to be prepared for stuff like this. Walking in the woods at night is part of the job. I rolled my eyes at his condescending tone, but kept quiet. After what felt like hours of trudging through the woods, we finally came across a rotting shed. Its wooden panels were covered in moss, and the roof sagged under the weight of years of neglect. A field of wheat stretched out behind it, eerily still in the night. This was it, the place where the Bourne tapes had been filmed. I couldn't stop shaking. This decrepit building held the answers I had been seeking for so long, and yet every fiber of my being was telling me to run. Crawford didn't hesitate, though. He kicked the door open and stormed inside. Flashlight raised, I followed close behind. The room was exactly as it appeared in the tapes. The window from the prophecy file, the table from Becoming a Man, even the layout matched warning perfectly. Police. Come out now, Crawford shouted, his voice echoing in the stillness. Nothing. No response. He paced the small room, muttering to himself. Then, without warning, he charged at the bedroom door, kicking it open with the same force as before. Dust filled the air, and for a moment I thought we were alone, and then Crawford froze. His back was to me, his flashlight still raised, but he didn't move. He just stood there, staring into the room. Crawford, what is it? I asked, my voice trembling. No response. God damn it. Crawford, what do you see? I demanded, the panic rising in my throat. He finally spoke, his voice barely a whisper. What the hell is this? I had to see for myself. I stepped forward, peering around the doorframe. The smell hit me first, an overpowering stench that made my stomach churn. Tears filled my eyes as I struggled to comprehend what I was seeing there, In the room hung a figure. I wasn't the only one who had been abducted. This poor soul had suffered the same fate, and their body was now suspended like some twisted, grotesque effigy. The sight was too much. I dropped to my knees and retched, the bile burning my throat. For the love of God, close the door. Crawford shouted, his voice breaking. I fumbled for the door handle, slamming it shut. The fractured wood didn't block out the horror that lay beyond it. James, the voice wasn't Crawford's. My heart stopped. Slowly, I turned toward the shed's entrance. Standing in the doorway was a figure, a person dressed in a long, white gown, too large for their frame. The sleeves dragged along the floor as they walked toward me. Their face was painted white, their eyes shadowed and black, their lips a garish red. Golden blonde curls framed their face, creating an unsettling contrast with their expressionless eyes. I couldn't move. I was paralyzed, trapped in that moment as the figure drew closer. Their arms reached out, ready to embrace me. Please, no, I whispered, squeezing my eyes shut. Please, ... When I opened them again, the figure's face was inches from mine. Their cold arms wrapped around my shoulders. Get the hell off him, Crawford roared, pulling the figure off me and slamming them into the wall. James, go. I didn't need to be told twice. I bolted, racing into the woods as screams echoed behind me. I ran blindly, my feet tripping over roots and branches, my mind consumed by terror. I didn't stop until I collapsed, exhausted, in the middle of the forest. When the sun rose, I wandered aimlessly until I found my way back to the road. I went straight to the station and told them everything. They sent out search parties, but no one found the shed, the figure, or Detective Crawford. I wish I had never seen those tapes. I can't sleep. I see that figure everywhere, in every shadow, and every corner of my mind. I'm sorry, but I can't keep posting about this. The cameras have been handed over to someone else. I'm done. I'm sorry. I have a story that made me truly believe in the paranormal. I used to see spirits as a child, but this experience in 2017 confirmed it. I went to Australia to visit my brother, who'd moved there in 2007 with his partner and their 3 kids, Lily 8, Tom 7, and Harry 4. They lived in a bungalow in a suburb called Leeming, and I stayed in a room at the back of the house near Lily and Tom's room, but with enough privacy. From the start, strange things happened in that room. My hands would get freezing cold every time I walked in. The pets refused to go inside, and I heard noises in the air conditioning, even when it wasn't on. I also heard noises from the kitchen, night when everyone else was asleep, but I didn't think much of it. About a month into my stay, my brother had to leave for work at the mines. He would work there for 2 weeks at a time, then return home for 1 week. So it was just his partner, the kids, and me in the house. Sometimes Harry would wake up on the couch while we were watching TV night and say, "The people are going through the walls," before going back to sleep. We figure it was just a nightmare since he was only 4 and hadn't watched any scary shows or movies. 3 days after my brother left for work, we were all having dinner. The kitchen was shaped like a triangle, with a dining table and a nook just off the side. From the table, we could see down one hallway, which led to my brother's room and the living room. There was another hallway that led to my room and Lily and Tom's rooms, but you couldn't see it from where we were sitting. Lily and Tom sat across from me, Harry was next to me, and my brother's partner was at the head of the table with her back to the hallway leading to my brother's room. While we were eating, Harry kept staring down that hallway. We looked at each other, confused. Suddenly, Harry started crying and shaking. then climbed onto his mom's lap, still staring over her shoulder at the hallway. His panic grew worse until he pointed toward the hallway, crying, "The people are coming." His mom immediately picked him up and ran through the hallway to my brother's room, leaving me, Lily, and Tom behind. I was only 17 at the time, and I had no idea what to do against something I couldn't see. The kids were scared, too, so they ran to me. I tried to keep the dining table between us and whatever might be coming. Oh, I knew a table wouldn't stop a ghost. After what felt like minutes, but was probably only seconds, I grabbed Lily and Tom and ran to my brother's room where their mom and Harry were. We were all shaken up and terrified. That night, none of us slept alone. We all stayed in my brother's room. I started researching psychics and house cleansings, hoping to get rid of whatever was haunting us. Fear feeds bad spirits, and the amount of fear in that house was enough to attract a whole frenzy of them. Eventually, I found a woman who performed cleanses and arranged for her to come. My brother didn't believe us, and we agreed not to tell the kids what the woman was going to do. When the day came and my brother was back home, the woman arrived. We took the kids to the park while she did her thing. She live-streamed the cleanse, using gadgets to talk to the spirits, so naturally I watched it while we were at the park. I don't remember everything she said, but I will never forget one moment. When she reached my room, she asked, "What do you want?" And through the spirit box, we clearly heard, "The boy, I nearly lost it." She continued cleansing the house, using sage, salt, and all the usual methods. After she finished, we returned to the house. As soon as we walked in, Harry looked around and said, "The people are gone." We hadn't told him anything about the cleanse, but he just knew. After that, my room wasn't cold anymore, and the pets were willing to come inside. As the woman was leaving, she told my brother, "Don't bring any rocks back next time." My brother used to bring the kids red rocks from the mines as souvenirs. What we didn't know was that some of those rocks had spirits attached to them. One was a witch doctor who had trapped other spirits in the house, and he was a one who wanted Harry. We never told the woman about the rocks, and they had been hidden in the kids' wardrobe. The fact that she knew about them made our blood run cold. After that, my brother and his partner broke the lease and moved. Everything went back to normal, but I'll always remember not to bring rocks into my house. You never know what you're inviting in. I knew it was him from the cologne. It was always the cheap mall kiosk stuff. He swore you couldn't tell the difference. I never had the heart to tell him he was wrong. It was about 3 a.m. when I felt him get into bed with me. The king we used to share felt empty without him. I felt the bed shift. I felt someone nuzzle up close to me. I swear I heard him whisper into my ear, "Hey baby," he cooed. "I'm here now." I rolled over to kiss him. I needed this. Of course, there was nobody there. Jack had died 3 months ago in this apartment of a drug overdose. We met in our early 20s, me being a fresh young gay on Grindr, newly out of the closet, and wondering why so many people wanted to party. Enter Jack, someone who had spent his time and left said party. He was more versed than me in life experience by a mile. Homeless at 16 by parents who wouldn't accept him, Jack fell into what most kicked-out gays do, a life of drugs and alcohol. He grew up fast, grew up hard, and was exposed to things a kid his age shouldn't have been. I'm not making excuses. He made a lot of bad choices, too. A jail stint and court-ordered rehab set him straight, thankfully. Things were good, or so I had thought. 6 months ago, I noticed changes in him. He was run down, tired, He repeatedly said he couldn't sleep and had nightmares. I thought he was overworked. He had found himself a great construction gig and was fond of overtime. It helped keep his head on straight. He'd say, 3 months ago, I came back to our apartment to find him slouched over on our couch. His face was contorted into a scene of painful shock. I panicked. I don't know what happened next. My memories just flash a bit, like a slideshow after this. 911 was called. The doctors and coroners were stumped. All signs pointed to a heart attack. I overheard one EMT say sourly after I divulged Jack's drug history that the drug use finally caught up with him. True or not, I almost punched her in the face. Time stopped for me after that for a while. I had to put on the funeral. It was a lot for me. I felt like I was covered in molasses. I don't remember how it went. I think it was a small turnout, mostly co-workers, all very sympathetic. Of course, I can't remember much of that first month. I was too deep in my grief. I was struck with a fever twice. I could barely get out of bed. I'm sure it was a combination of the depression as well. That month was brutal. I couldn't find a reason to get out of bed most days. I started snapping out of it when the noises started, bumps in the middle of the night, shuffling, doors closing and opening, footsteps. I wasn't sleeping most nights. I couldn't. The noises occurred with too much frequency to give me a respite. I thought I was going crazy until the night the bathroom faucet turned on. I shuffled out of bed, groggy and half asleep. I got to the closed bathroom door and tried to open it locked. The light was on, and something was casting a shadow. I knocked. Clear as day, I heard Jack's voice. "Hold on, babe. I'm almost done." I slammed the door open. His toothbrush fell from midair to the ground. The sink turned off. There was a large thump behind me. I didn't sleep that night. The noises continued, whispers. A few nights later was when he climbed into bed with me. I haven't told anyone about that yet. What would they say? It's grief. It will pass. You still feel him around you. I didn't want to hear that bullshit. I knew what I felt. He was in bed with me. The dreams came next, and that should have been my first warning in retrospect. They were so beautiful. Could you fault me? Put yourself in my shoes. They started out as memories of the good times he and I had together. The first date at a bowling alley, the first kiss at the drive-in theater, the times he knew I would hold dear to me. They were incredibly vivid. Then he started addressing me. At first, briefly, not much. Just vague feelings or concepts of conversations you had in those memories. Talking about the tiny things you never knew you'd miss, like corn dogs from a county fair. I wasn't sure whether or not those conversations had ever happened. They were always foggy memories of the best times, but they got increasingly more and more specific. As the dreams became more detailed, it felt like Jack and I were having entire conversations in my sleep. It was comforting at first. I woke up each day with a sense of connection, like he was still with me, guiding me through my grief. The world didn't feel as empty. His voice was clear. His laugh was just as I remembered. It made the days bearable, but then things started to shift. The dreams no longer replayed memories. They began to take on a life of their own. Jack was asking me strange things we had never talked about when he was alive. He'd mention places I'd never been to, describe people I didn't know. One night he asked me to meet him at a specific park he used to visit. I woke up with the urge to go, like it was a command. Sleep got worse. If it wasn't Jack visiting my dreams, it was the noises he created at night. I began to feel ill again. One night he came to me in a dream. He took my hand, looked me in the eye, and began to cry. "God, I've missed you," he sobbed. It was the first time he seemed to acknowledge what happened. He leaned in and kissed me gently on the lips. He hugged me, and that cheap familiar cologne scent filled my nostrils. I felt a tear go down my cheek. I missed this. He leaned closer, and I felt his breath in my ear as he whispered the words that snapped me awake. You should come with me. I woke up in a cold sweat. I could taste his lips on mine. The words and implications still lingered in my mind. I loved him. I was young and naive, sure, but he was my first. You remember that kind of love, right? I know now that life goes on, but during that time, for reasons I find out later, his words grabbed me. What was so good about being without him anyway? The noses persisted. He kept visiting, asking again for me to join him, the request growing heavier with each passing night. I wanted to ask what he meant, but I couldn't, or I guess didn't need to. I knew what it meant. I didn't want to admit it to myself at the time that it was a possibility. I barely slept. When I did, I wasn't rested. I felt like the walking dead already. Was that why I was seeing Jack everywhere? I didn't tell anyone about it. I didn't want to hear their conventional wisdom about grief. The thing that concerned me the most was the sleepwalking. I had never done it in my 32 years of life, and suddenly it starts when my dead boyfriend decides to visit. I'd wake up in precarious positions, never in deadly danger, but just enough where a wrong turn or a fall could break an arm. Things escalated one night. I would have died had it not been for gravy. Jack was in my dreams again. We were at the county fair. We were holding hands, staring dumbfounded at the rides set up the night before. Jack had always loved them. I think it spoke to the risk-taker in him. He adored theme parks and roller coasters. I wouldn't dare. I was a notorious scaredy cat. He asked me why I wasn't smiling like I used to. He knew the answer. I know you're tired and scared, he said, rubbing my hand with both of his. But I need you to answer soon. I don't know how much longer I can visit like this. It didn't occur to me that he might be doing this on borrowed time. My eyes landed on the tilt-a-whirl nearby, and he noticed. His face lit up. Please, I don't know how much longer I'm here, he pleaded, yanking my hand toward the ride. Give me this, just this, please. It's not that scary, I thought. I felt a yank on my hand and took a step forward. Suddenly, I felt something dart between my legs, and the next thing I knew, I was face-planting in the street. I rolled over, dazed, and my eyes turned to my savior. Not 3 feet away was a small gray cat with streaks of black all over him. He had what looked like a slightly torn right ear, and let out the deepest meow I think I've ever heard from a cat. It sounded like the guy smoked a pack a day. He was thin, but not deathly so either. He had a neighborhood root of friends to feed him or was an adept hunter. I heard a honk and scrambled out of the street just in time for a minivan to barrel down the road. I stared, dumbfounded, processing what had just happened. I clearly sleepwalked into danger. This was bad. Did Jack lead me here? I felt dizzy. The ball of fur that saved my life rubbed against my legs. Purring, it snapped me back to reality. I looked down at him, and he looked back at me. EXPCTANTLY. It was 3 a.m. I was tired. Everything felt heavy. But I looked down at this little guy, and I knew not to fight it. I walked back to my place, and sure enough, he followed me, meowing loudly, sounding suspiciously cranky. At the same time, I walked inside, and he followed instantly. I have a cat now. This is how these things happen. I've heard of the cat distribution system. In the dark of it all, I had a light, and his name was Gravy. He looked like gravy. Your pet name isn't any better. He was healthy as far as I could tell. Neutered already, which meant he had experience with people, good or bad. He was skittish, but I knew that was to be expected. It wasn't my first cat rodeo. I had him set up with the proper kit within the next few days and scheduled his shots. Curiously, the one spot he reacted the most negatively to was where Jack had died. He'd get on his haunches and hiss, but I let it be. My brain didn't register the possibility of why until later. Gravy was the thing that kept me going. He gave me a reason. He was just the right mixture of affectionate and cranky aloofness I needed in a cat. I needed Gravy because Jack wouldn't let up. The dreams took on a more urgent tone. The first time he returned, I told him about my accident, and he swore he didn't do anything. He claimed that his time was limited. I had to make my decision because he was being pulled away somewhere, he said. We wouldn't be together unless I left with him before he was taken. Nobody would love you like me, he said. The noises grew more frequent and violent. Gravy saved my sanity during those times. He'd register and react to them too often, hissing and growling. The noises were loud. Plates would shatter against the wall often. I didn't give a damn about setting up cameras to capture it. People would say I was faking it anyway. The dreams grew worse. The colors faded, and Jack appeared with more urgency each time. Sometimes his face looked slightly off, like his skin was stretched just a little too tight. The smell of his cologne became tinged with dirt and soil. He'd exclaim, frightened, that his time was up. He could make it quick. He could help end things painlessly. He promised. I couldn't answer. I later realized that if you're asked point blank, if you want to die and can't respond, you don't want to die. He paced in front of me, clearly agitated. This was the first time I'd ever seen this version of him angry. It frightened me. I felt myself grow warm. You chose a cat over me, he yelled. He took a few aggressive steps forward and grabbed my shoulders. I screamed. His hands burned against my skin. He came close to my face, and I saw bits of bone exposed by his too tight facial skin. His breath made me gag. You will come with me. His jaw unhinged as if to swallow me whole, and I woke up screaming. I didn't startle Gravy, who was watching the side of the room, growling. His fur was bristled. He hissed at something, but I couldn't see what. A wave of tiredness hit me like a brick, and I fell asleep again. The second I closed my eyes, there's the smell. It's his cologne. I was dreaming. I knew it. But this wasn't like the others. The color was back. Things felt like they were supposed to be. Not some strange hellscape or uncanny valley. I was in a version of our bedroom from our earlier days, asleep. I lay facing the wall when I heard the door open. I felt the bed shift much more weight than if it were Gravy. I felt fingertips along my back. His touch didn't burn like before. It felt electric. Goosebumps ran down my arms. He breathed on the back of my neck, and the hairs stood up. He lightly nibbled my ear. I knew in my heart that this wasn't real. I didn't care. I hadn't been touched since Jack. You don't realize how starved you are for touch until you've got a plate of food in front of you. I pressed my back against him and heard him laugh. He rolled on top of me and smiled. He was just as beautiful as the day I met him. He leaned down to kiss me with a passion I had never experienced before. It took me by surprise how much I needed this moment. Maybe he was right. I felt pressure in my temples, and my lungs began to struggle as he forced his tongue down my throat. Part of me screamed to fight back, but it was drowned out by how good it felt to be touched by him. It was comforting. My body began to spasm. I looked Jack in the eyes and saw that his pupils had turned jet black. I felt his tongue swell in my throat as air became harder to acquire. A long, guttural growl cut through the dream like a knife. A hiss. I felt Jack's weight shift. I heard him scream. Instantly, I snapped awake. I was back in my bedroom, still feeling something on me. But I couldn't register what Gravy was doing, floating on top of me. He was attacking something. That much was clear. He bit down hard on something, which roared out in pain. Flecks of brown ooze splattered from the bite wounds Gravy was inflicting. Something connected with my jaw. It felt like a sledgehammer, and I fell off the bed, stumbling against the wall. I couldn't process what I was seeing. Gravy was clearly still attached to and attacking something in midair that took up space, but I couldn't see it fully. He growled, and I noticed some cuts on Gravy's stomach. Suddenly, Gravy was flung against the wall, and I felt something cold and strong grasp my neck and squeeze. Without missing a beat, Gravy was back on the thing again. The grip on my neck loosened, and I gasped for air. I heard a yowl, and suddenly Gravy was thrown against the wall, held there as something squeezed the life out of him. Whatever was holding him grew more visible from the cuts and gashes Gravy had inflicted. My illusions faded. Jack was killing my cat, and I was next. I felt a stream of urine trickle down my leg. I started to get dizzy in that instant. Gravy made eye contact with me. His face became strained and focused, and he meowed twice, snapping me into action. I know this sounds crazy, but I know what I heard. Gravy spoke and said to words not Jack, fight or flight kicked in. I had little in the way of weapons until my eyes fell upon a frame photo of Jack on my nightstand. I lunged for it and brought it down hard, shattering the glass cover. I grabbed the largest shard without even thinking, not registering the horrible cut I had until later. I lunged for the space between Gravy and me and jabbed the shard of glass into the air. It connected with a wet thud, spurting that same brown liquid into the air. Gravy fell to the ground. More bits of whatever was harassing us slowly began to take form from the shard of glass, until it became completely revealed. Whatever fight was in me absolutely fled at the sight of the rotting corpse in front of me, dressed in the clothes I buried Jack in. He growled at me, his dead, black eyes rolling lifelessly in his skull. My eyes watered at the smell, and the thing wheezed, laughing. It held the shard of glass in its hand, covered in its own ooze, and swiped at me. I held my forearm up just in time to catch the cut. Neither had noticed Gravy repositioning himself between us. Completely visible now, the Jack thing lunged at me again. Before it could finish its swing, Gravy was on its throat. The force of the tackle took it by surprise, and it stumbled backward. Gravy tore and gnashed at the thing's throat, coating himself in the same gunk that poured out of it. Its rotting hands grabbed at Gravy to pull him away, but Gravy held strong. I didn't hesitate this time. I tore the shard of glass away from the thing and shoved it down the other side of its throat, back and forth. I felt the fire burn in my hand from the cuts of holding it tight, but adrenaline kicked in. I didn't care. All I cared about was working on the other side of this monster's neck while my cat got the other. The thing struggled, but we had the upper hand. I hacked away at rotting muscle and flesh until finally I felt it was good enough. I stood up, positioning myself above the thing, and grabbed its temples. Any resemblance of Jack was gone. It was just a rotting mass of flesh now, roaring in pain. I didn't know if it would work, but it felt right. I planted my knees on its shoulders and pulled its head away from its body with as much force as I could muster. It didn't require much, and I overcompensated, landing on my butt against my nightstand, the lifeless head of the rotting corpse still in my hands. The thing's body thrashed less and less before it stopped. I held the head in my hands, feeling the activity slowly begin to die inside it, too. I felt the familiar fur and purr against my legs as Gravy nuzzled against me. "Good boy," I said. I dropped the head on the ground. I should have been surprised when it slowly turned to ash and began to crumble, but nothing could surprise me anymore. The body followed suit. I eyed Gravy, and then my own hand, and promptly decided on the hospital for both of us. Gravy required multiple stitches. I told the vets he protected me from a wild animal. Technically, I wasn't wrong. He was bruised and beat up, but the vet claimed he must have been a fighter. She had no idea I required stitches as well. My hands and forearms were sliced up. I eagerly showed my stitches to Gravy the second I could. I'd like to think there was a bit of camaraderie there. He sniffed them and promptly showed me his, but before taking a nap, I slept like a rock that night. Any sort of physical and wellness was gone. The apartment was quiet, but I couldn't stay. Of course, I couldn't. I had to move on. I couldn't hold on to hope that there was even a fraction of Jack left. We moved out shortly after. One ghost was enough. Was it even a ghost? Did Gravy know I was in danger? Did he come to me specifically? Did I really hear Gravy speak English that night? I sat down and asked him. As crazy as it sounded, I sat Gravy on the kitchen table and asked if he had said "not Jack" that night. The air stunk. He farted and hopped off the table. I left it at that. I know I feel safer with him around. This dumb, cranky ball of fur saved my life twice. I did some research after that. I didn't realize that cats essentially domesticated themselves. I knew various cultures cherished them as magical creatures, but pulling themselves out of the food chain by getting domesticated is crazy to me, unless they did it to protect us from things they can see that we can't. I don't like to think about it. I also don't like to think about the one door in my hallway where Gravy always stops to hiss when we come back from our walks. The neighbor who lives there is a female college student living alone, and I've heard her sobbing with surprising intensity often, to the point where I vitally wonder if something was wrong. Something felt wrong. I didn't want to admit it. I don't like to think about the rapid, familiar thumping I hear from her apartment sometimes. I don't like to think about the time Gravy stopped at the door and looked up at me, asking with his eyes, "Hey, are we doing this or what?" I took a step away from the door, but Gravy held firm. I eyed him. Nobody would believe me. But this sly bastard nodded at me. I took a deep breath, rolled my eyes, and knocked. "Are you okay? Do you need help?" I had just knocked on the door of a perfect stranger because I thought my cat wanted me to. The girl on the other side of the door, still sobbing uncontrollably, was a college student. I knew that much. It was clear from the hurried expression on her face as we passed each other in the hall, her juggling a mountain of books, her laptop bag, and a thermos of what smelled like coffee. I remembered those days. I had dropped out in a fit of anger during my junior year of college. The stock market had just crashed in 2008, and suddenly the bill of goods I had been sold, the ticket to my American dream, was yanked out of my hands. What would have happened if I'd stayed the course? Maybe I wouldn't be taking orders from my cat, I thought glumly. Gravy pawed at my leg and looked at the door. The woman was still crying. I knocked again, louder this time. "Excuse me, are you okay?" I asked. The door swung open, and there she stood, covered in dirt from her stomach down. She was a cute girl, blonde, shorter than me. Her hair was up in a ponytail, but that hadn't stopped it from getting kicked with dirt, too. The oversized blue hoodie she wore had flecks of wetness on it, whether from her crying or something else. I couldn't tell. She attempted a smile through the tears. She opened her mouth to speak, and before I knew it, Gravy had dashed inside her apartment. "Damn it, Gravy," I called after him. I heard a curt meow in response, but he was out of my sight. A laugh cut through her pain, and I saw her smile. For the first time since I'd moved here, she seemed lighter at that moment. I glanced behind her to see the source of her frustration. Two vases that once held large flowers had shattered on the floor, coating the hardwood with dirt and grime. "It's okay," she said, extending her hand. She sniffled. "I'm Amber. You're the new guy, right?" I nodded and shook her hand. Before I could say anything in return, Gravy darted into the room at full speed. He didn't notice the loose rug he tried to stop on, and inertia sent him tumbling into a wall. "Oh, poor thing." Amber instantly went to Gravy, bent down, and cradled him in her arms. I watched, dumbfounded, as his personality shifted completely. Gone was the aloof, deep-meowed ball of fur, replaced by an adorable, loving shelter cat. He nudged his face into her arms as she held him, purring loudly. She motioned for me to come in, and I carefully entered, stepping over the broken vases and flowers. As I stepped past the threshold, I saw the broom and dustpan Amber was using to clean up the mess. Without hesitating, I grabbed it and began to sweep while she continued to baby Gravy. She noticed me quickly and stood up, Gravy still in her arms. He held eye contact with me, almost unrecognizable in his cuteness, and meowed in 3 short bursts at me. His eyes darted to the hallway leading to the rest of the apartment. "You don't have to do that," Amber said. She still held Gravy. I knocked them over. I scoffed at her. "Nonsense. I'm a good neighbor." "You sounded like you were having a day." She smiled warmly, and I noticed her lips tremble a bit. This act of kindness had made a clear impact. She pet Gravy and sat down at her dining table as I continued to sweep. "You wouldn't believe me if I told you," she said. Gravy continued to stare at me and meowed again. 3 short bursts. I emptied the dirt and flowers into the trash can. She smiled up at me, but suddenly became tense. I knew exactly what this was. "I didn't get your name," she said, holding Gravy a bit tighter. "I'm Sean," I said with a smile. "Nice to officially meet you." "And that cute, I guess, guy in your lap is Gravy." I heard Gravy exhale loudly and grunt, sounding annoyed. Amber giggled at the name and hugged him tighter. Then, on a dime, she became tense again and stared at me. "I have a taser and pepper spray nearby." Yep, I wasn't wrong. This young woman had just let a man her age into her apartment without really knowing me. The realization seemed to hit her, and while she never let go of Gravy, I definitely noticed her muscles tense and demeanor shift. I could tell she was wishing I was that fabled bear instead of a very real strange man. I raised my hands in front of my chest. I'd had to do this song and dance before. "That's great, hon," I said, carefully putting some emphasis on hon. "But you aren't necessarily my type." She studied me up and down, looked at Gravy, and breathed a deep sigh of relief. She let Gravy go onto the table, and he immediately plopped to his side, stretched, and showed her his belly. The smile on her face grew as she excitedly rubbed his belly. "He never let me do that. I'm sorry. I didn't mean to be rude," she explained. "I had a feeling you were gay, you know. Single, the well-dressed guy in his 30s with a cat." I thought men have had me on edge lately," she said softly. I noticed the bruises on her arm for the first time. Gravy, without warning, darted back toward the hallway. I heard the same short 3 meows, followed by a thump. With Gravy gone, Amber's smile began to fade again. She eyed the remnants of the plants in the garbage and began to cry once more. I immediately pulled a chair up to her and put my hand on her shoulder. I knew a relationship bat signal when I saw one. Thankfully, I had never discounted the power I had as a gay man. When it came to comforting or being there for heterosexual women in pain, I get it. Sisters, talk to me, I said to her. Looks like you need a friend, or at least some objective pseudo-stranger, yeah. She laughed, and we both eased up, then jumped, startled at Gravy once again flying into the room at full speed. He leapt onto the table, directly in front of me, eyes wide. The adorable fur ball in Amber's lap was gone. Back in its place was the same scraggly ball of energy that had woken me up that morning by slapping me in the face with his paw. He me out loudly directly in my face, slapped me 3 times in succession, and darted back off the table and into the hallway. I saw Amber eye me inquisitively. He's just got the zoomies, I replied. He's aggressive. You shouldn't let him hit you like that. She replied instantly. The response surprised even her. And there it is. I heard the faint sound of Gravy in the hallway. I just got out of a bad situation, she said, not making eye contact. She rubbed the back of her head and suddenly became aware again, the bruises showing. I let the implications hit me, but knew enough not to address this directly. These things, especially when they're fresh, need a delicate touch. I waited for her to continue, and she began to tear up. My ex left a week ago, she said, still not making eye contact. She sniffled and laughed, the sudden change in demeanor confusing me. You won't believe me, she said. I heard more scratching, a low, pronounced meow. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up. You'd be surprised at what I believe. She leaned back in her chair, sighed, and for the first time since opening up, made eye contact with me. I think my ex cursed me. My heart sank, and the sudden reality of the situation hit me like a ton of bricks. I was no longer comforting a poor girl in need of a friend. I was here for something else, something my damn cat of all things had pushed me into. I began to sweat. She leaned forward and began to speak. It's ridiculous. I feel so dumb, she said with a self-deprecating chuckle. But have you ever heard of this idiot wannabe ghost hunter, Chris Spector? My heart began to pound. Panic filled my lungs as I felt myself getting dragged into a world I wanted no part of. I saw her eye me, and I regained my composure, shaking my head. No, I hadn't. That's the problem, she laughed dryly. Do you know how much ghost hunting pays? God, I hope I never find out. I shook my head again. No, nothing. Not when you're some loser that's not even on YouTube yet, she scoffed. Just some dumb underground, startup video site for other paranormal losers. I heard more scratching from the hallway. I eyed Amber and realized she hadn't noticed. He comes home one night, stinking of cheap scotch, she said, getting into the story. Swore he had the big thing that'd make us rich finally. Got his big break, he said. Something about how proud he was. Pissed me off. I'd heard this before. I had it. I can't blame you, I said. My eyes drifted to the bruises again. Not good to hide it, I guess, she said, unfurling her sweatshirt. I winced at the patchwork of bruises along her arms. The fresh ones are at the top, from when I told him to leave. The others, yeah, he got violent. The apartment is in my name, thankfully, and he didn't like being reminded of that. He stormed through the place, locking himself in the rooms. I let him have it. I mean really have it. Told him next time he laid hands on me, I was calling the police, and ever since I asked, the tears began again. Gravy darted into my peripheral from the hallway, raising his paws in the air frantically. I raised a finger to him, stopping ridiculous. Things have been breaking. I hear things crawling around at night. I feel something wet and slimy in bed with me. I didn't knock over the pots just now. She leaned in closer, whispering. Something else did. Gravy had snuck toward me during all this and began tugging on my pants. Amber, I said slowly. Bathroom, I'm so sorry. She pointed down the hall and smiled warmly. To your left. I got up, and Gravy led the way. I felt an immediate sense of stupidity at my actions, acknowledging that I was, in fact, following my cat. Gravy reached the bathroom and scurried inside, hopping up on the toilet seat. I slowly entered and felt an immediate sense of something being desperately wrong. I closed the door behind me and eyed Gravy. He sniffed the air and hopped up from the toilet to the sink, beginning to paw at the medicine cabinet. I stepped in front of the toilet and unzipped, eyeing him the entire time. He pawed harder and stared at me. It's not polite to look in someone's medicine cabinet, I said. Gravy meowed back and hissed. Fine. I reached over with my free hand to open the cabinet as I began to pee. It slowly swung open, revealing nothing. Just the same medicine cabinet as any young 20-something girl. I scoffed at Gravy and rolled my eyes. Happy? Gravy stared questioningly at the cabinet, not the cabinet, I realized, but the photograph taped to the back of the cabinet door. It was Amber and a tall, square-shouldered brick-house of a man with a receding hairline, stubble that seemed to desperately want to be a beard, and a tight black t-shirt that read The Spectre. It was clear who I was looking at. What wasn't clear was why Amber still had this, without warning. A torrent of water erupted from the toilet, covering me in a mixture of stale toilet water, my own pee, and much to my disgust some unspecified sewage. It hit me with such force that it knocked me back against the wall. I was dizzy, vision blurred, and the smell nearly took me out. I heard Gravy shake and growl next to me, clearly agitated that he also got soaked. The toilet gurgled 3 times. I wiped the slime and pee from my face, gagging. I heard the sounds of claws on porcelain and looked to the toilet just in time to see 3 well, I wasn't sure what I was seeing. My brain was already having trouble processing the sewage explosion, and now I was being handed what could only be described as reptilian rats. They had the claws, gnarled and yellow, and jagged incisors jutting out over their bottom lips. Their bodies were a mix of fur and scales and random tufts. The tails were longer than any rat I'd ever seen, and they chittered and squeaked to each other in an oddly excited, almost mischievous fashion. The doorknob began to turn. I hadn't locked it, I realized, and one of the sewer monsters sprang at it immediately. Are you okay? What was that? Amber asked from the other side, concerned. The night hung thick with tension as I stood in the aftermath of chaos, breathing heavily and covered in grime. Gravy, my trusty feline companion, darted around my apartment like a tiny tornado, seemingly unfazed by the remnants of our encounter. I shook my head, trying to shake off the adrenaline that still coursed through me. Just moments ago, I had confronted the very embodiment of Amber's torment, Chris Spectre, a man whose mere presence had turned her world upside down. The memory of his scornful words and the tattoos marking his neck sent a chill down my spine. They were the same glyphs I had found on the back of the photograph in Amber's bathroom, a grotesque reminder of the dark forces at play. I sank into the couch, feeling the weight of the world settle heavily on my shoulders. My apartment, usually a haven, now felt like a battlefield littered with remnants of my confrontation. Gravy returned to my side, purring softly, as if to reassure me that everything would be all right. I had fought off creatures that defied logic, but the real battle felt far from over. The next morning, I woke up to the sound of Gravy meowing insistently. It was a reminder that life continued, even after the night of horrors. I glanced at my phone. Messages from Amber lit up the screen. Are you okay? Can we talk? I think there's more to this. I knew we needed to meet, but I also felt a gnawing anxiety about what we would uncover. I spent the morning getting ready, splashing water on my face to clear the remnants of sleep and fear. Gravy watched, eyes wide and curious. As I made my way to the door, the walk to Amber's apartment was a blur, my mind racing with thoughts of the night before. What if Chris came back? What if those creatures returned? The air felt heavy, thick with the lingering scent of dread. As I approached her door, Amber opened it almost instantly, relief washing over her features when she saw me. "You came," she said, stepping aside to let me in. "Of course. I'm not going to leave you to face this alone." She led me into the living room, where the remnants of our last conversation hung in the air like a fog. I found something," Amber said, her voice shaky as she handed me a small notebook. I flipped through the pages, recognizing her handwriting, filled with frantic notes and drawings of the glyphs. "I started researching," she explained. "I thought maybe there was a way to break whatever curse Chris put on me." A knot formed in my stomach as I read her notes. It became clear that the symbols weren't just random markings. They were part of something much larger, a ritualistic pattern tied to the paranormal world. They might be linked to whatever those creatures were last night, I said, trying to keep my voice steady. Amber nodded, eyes wide. "I think they were trying to communicate. Or maybe they were sent to collect something. I have to figure out what he did." Gravy, ever the sentinel, padded over to the notebook, sniffing at the pages. He meowed sharply, as if urging us to hurry. "Maybe he didn't just curse you," I suggested. "What if he summoned them? What if they were tied to him?" Amber's eyes darkened as she considered this. "Then we have to confront him. We can't let him get away with this." As the plan formed between us, I felt a spark of determination igniting in my chest. We would face this darkness together, even if it meant walking into the lion's den. "I'll help you find him," I promised, determination lacing my words. "And whatever we need to do to end this, we'll do it together." Amber nodded, her resolve matching mine. "Thank you, but we need to be careful. Chris isn't just some guy, he knows things. He's not going to go down without a fight." Gravy meowed again, this time more insistent, as if he understood the stakes. "Let's gather everything we have," I said. "We'll need a plan, and I think I know where we might find him." With a newfound sense of purpose, we began to prepare for the inevitable confrontation. I couldn't shake the feeling that we were diving deeper into a world that didn't want us, a realm filled with shadows and horrors waiting to consume us. But together, we had a chance, no matter how slim it might be. As we moved forward, I glanced at Gravy, who stared back with an intensity that reminded me just how much was at stake. The weight of the past loomed over us, but I knew that with every step, we were forging our own path through the darkness. And in that moment, I understood. I would not let fear dictate my fate. Together, we would face whatever horrors awaited us, and perhaps, just perhaps, we could reclaim the light from the shadows of the past.